On a winter night long forgotten, Brenda Frazier stood before a mirror that seemed to waver with secrets, its silvered surface catching the tremble of a girl the world believed it knew. Outside, distant laughter drifted through the halls, yet she felt only the hush of unseen burdens gathering like shadows behind her celebrated beauty on that silent night alone. Welcome, dear listener. Share when and where you join this quiet journey, weaving your voice into our circle across time, and please subscribe to help keep these timeless stories alive. The sound that lingers in the marble hall seems at first like nothing more than the breath of a forgotten draft. Yet if one listens closely, it carries the faint rhythm of a distant waltz, the kind once played in rooms lit by chandeliers, whose crystals trembled beneath the weight of expectation. It is from this trembling echo that the story unfolds, for Brenda Frazier's world was built upon rooms like these, bright places where youth was polished into spectacle and where the quiet heart of a girl had little space to grow. As we settle into the beginning of her tale, imagine America in the uneasy years between two wars, a country both restless and hungry for glamour, eager to chase the illusion of sparkle, even as shadows stretched across the world beyond its borders. Society pages had become a kind of theater, where the wealthy and the willing stepped into roles scripted not by their own desires, but by the public's appetite for fantasy. It was in this theater that Brenda would someday be cast, though in these early reflections, we approach the stage slowly, mindful of how fragile the curtain truly was. The era that raised her was one of shifting values, the old aristocracies clinging to their rituals, even as a new, media-driven culture rose like a tide around them. Newspapers did not simply report society, they shaped it, choosing their darlings, their villains, their symbols. And who could have foreseen that one day, a soft-spoken young woman would be carried so swiftly into their spotlight that even she could no longer distinguish where her private self ended and her public image began. Yet before she became a figure in that great performance, Brenda was simply a child moving through corridors, burdened by adult concerns. Listeners may wonder how a life so gilded could also be so fragile. But perhaps that is always the paradox of inherited worlds. We often think privilege shields, yet sometimes it binds even more tightly, shaping destinies long before those who bear them can speak in their own defense. In her early years, long before the cameras and the crowds, the forces that would one day define her were already gathering, quietly threading themselves through her days with the patience of vines, seeking a place to cling. These threads were woven from history itself, from traditions built across generations, from names whose weight was felt more than understood, from expectations whispered but never questioned. And as America leaned eagerly toward modernity, the families who belonged to its elite circles clung to their customs with a determination that could inspire or suffocate, depending on which side of their gates one stood. Moving slowly through this time, it becomes clear that Brenda's story cannot be separated from the larger landscape around her. The Great Depression still pressed its heaviness onto the country, yet the upper echelons of society held fast to their ceremonies and celebrations, insisting upon continuity even as so many others faced uncertainty. One might ask whether these rituals served as comfort or escape, or whether they were merely the only language the privileged knew how to speak. In that world, the debutante ball had transformed from a simple rite of passage into a spectacle of wealth, a demonstration of lineage, a public proclamation of belonging. It was here that society found its myths, and it was here that Brenda would one day become a myth herself. But in this first part of her chronicle, before the myths formed, we linger in the quiet spaces where her life had not yet dissolved into symbol. In those early decades of the 20th century, the idea of celebrity was taking on new shapes, no longer confined to artists or actors, but extending to anyone who could capture the collective imagination. Young women of good families became objects of fascination. Their photographs circulated not because they had achieved anything, but because they represented something the public wanted to believe still existed: refinement, beauty, order, and perhaps a reassurance that old structures still held firm. Into this shifting landscape, Brenda would eventually be thrust, though she had no voice in that movement, no more say than a leaf caught in the changing wind. And yet, as with all stories that stretch across time, one wonders whether some part of her felt the approach of that invisible tide even in her earliest years. In remembering the world she inherited, we should also consider its contrasts. For while her name would be printed in bold type across newspapers, the rest of the country struggled through unemployment lines and bread shortages. The divide between her life and the lives of most Americans grew so stark that it could not help but intensify the public's fascination. It is human nature, perhaps, to look toward whatever glitters when shadows grow long. But glitter can conceal as much as it reveals, and in Brenda's case, it concealed almost everything. Her later fame would be built upon moments crafted for her rather than chosen by her, and the world consumed those moments hungrily, rarely pausing to ask what lay beneath them. As we begin this long, quiet journey through the layers of her life, it is helpful to imagine the slow drift of time itself, moving like the soft sway of curtains across tall windows. The past does not rush, it settles. In that settling, we begin to see that Brenda was not merely a figure of glamour, but a reflection of the forces that shaped an era. She became the emblem of a nation's fascination with youth and beauty at a moment when those qualities were treated as fragile treasures that must be displayed before they faded. How many expectations can rest upon one person before they begin to bend, and how early does that bending begin? Perhaps such questions do not have firm answers, yet they guide us gently into understanding the world she would navigate. Even in this first chapter, we pause to acknowledge the quiet truth that stories like hers are not only about events, but about atmospheres, about the subtle ways environments shape souls. Brenda's world was full of polished surfaces, but behind every polished surface lies a reflection that may or may not be true. As we move deeper into her story, we carry with us the awareness that her life unfolded in rooms filled with light and rooms filled with silence, and that both played their role in sculpting the girl who would one day stand before a mirror, uncertain of the image looking back at her. And now, as that faint waltz in the marble hall grows softer, its last note lingering like a breath, caught between memory and forgetting, we step into the next part of her story, following the dim echo that leads toward the earliest days of her origins. The scent that lingers in the empty nursery is faint, almost impossible to place, as though it were carried from another time entirely, yet it rises again when one begins to trace the earliest threads of Brenda Frazier's life. For origins often carry their own quiet perfume, a mixture of inheritance, memory, and unspoken expectation. To understand how she came to stand beneath the heavy glow of chandeliers and under the collective gaze of a nation, one must walk slowly back to the beginning, to the moment before her name meant anything to anyone beyond her kin, to the days when she was simply a child born at the crossroads of two powerful families whose histories were filled with privilege, yet marked by fractures that would quietly shape her destiny long before she could form words to name them. In the soft hush of those early years, one can almost hear the muted rustle of silk gowns and the distant clink of silver from generations past, echoes reminding her that she was not merely herself, but the product of legacies built long before her arrival. It is said that children absorb atmospheres more readily than instructions, and when Brenda entered the world in 1921, she entered a social landscape where lineage defined identity, where wealth was both shield and burden, where names carried more weight than hearts could easily bear, especially the heart of a young girl who only longed for stable affection in a house where the walls themselves seemed to shift with tension. Her mother, the striking yet complicated socialite Brenda Germain Warden, brought with her a lineage of refinement, but also a hunger for recognition that left little room for softness. Her father, Frank Frazier, came from old Boston families whose fortunes were vast, yet whose emotional climates were often cold, shaped by generations accustomed to performing composure rather than expressing warmth. And between these two temperaments, the young Brenda found herself suspended, like a fragile thread pulled taut between two distant poles. The marriage between her parents was troubled almost from the start, not with explosive conflict, but with a quieter, more eroding kind of discontent, the kind that settles slowly into silence and leaves children to decode its meaning through the smallest gestures, the slightest pauses, the sharp glances exchanged during dinner. When adults retreat behind private barricades, children often wander into the spaces left behind, looking for clues. Perhaps even in her earliest memories, Brenda sensed that the home surrounding her was constructed more from obligation than from harmony. There is something both haunting and tender in imagining this young girl moving through such a world, her footsteps small against the vastness of an estate shaped by tradition. The halls she walked through were not filled with the steady warmth of a unified family, but rather with a tension that hummed like a low, persistent note beneath the surface of daily life. It is in such atmospheres that a child learns to watch carefully, to measure each face and tone, to anticipate shifts rather than express needs. Even before she learned the rituals of high society, Brenda was learning the rituals of emotional survival, a quiet attunement to others that would later become part of the very image people mistook for poise. When her parents' marriage dissolved, she was still very young, yet the impact of their separation pressed deep into her, as early fractures often do. Divorce in those circles was not merely a private rupture. It became a public matter, whispered about in drawing rooms, printed in newspapers, and analyzed by society matrons who viewed such events not through the lens of compassion, but through the rigid code of social propriety. One wonders what it feels like for a child to sense that her family's sorrows have become topics for others' conversation, that her personal world has been placed under the same scrutiny reserved for scandals among adults. Brenda was moved between her parents, each pulling her in different emotional directions, and even though she was adored in their own uneven ways, the love she received was seldom steady. Rather, it came in bursts, followed by absence, a rhythm that leaves a young heart uncertain of where to rest. There were times, perhaps, when the young Brenda looked out the windows of whichever home she occupied and saw the world beyond her family's rituals and arguments as something distant and unreachable, a place where children ran without carrying the weight of their parents' disappointments. Yet inside the sphere of the social elite, where appearances mattered above all, children were often molded into symbols long before their identities could take shape, and Brenda was no exception. Her mother, ambitious and aware of the power of beauty, took notice of her daughter's delicate features, her pale grace, her large, expressive eyes. In a different setting, these might have been received simply as the natural loveliness of a child, but in her world they became assets, tools to be polished. Even before Brenda understood the attention, she felt its pressure, for admiration from adults can easily become expectation. An expectation, once internalized, becomes a shadow that follows quietly behind every step. Her father offered affection in his own distant and practical way, but his influence was shaped more by duty than emotional presence. In the divided household of her childhood, Brenda learned that love sometimes came paired with conditions, that approval often depended on behavior, that her value could shift according to the public face her parents hoped to present through her. And so she grew into herself not in the freedom of play, but in the careful awareness of observation, as though someone were always watching, even when no one stood near. This sensation, once rooted deeply in youth, often endures into adulthood, shaping decisions and desires in ways that feel instinctive even long after their origins are forgotten. As she progressed into her early adolescence, the emotional terrain of her life grew increasingly complex. She was seen, but not understood. She was admired, but not deeply known. She was spoken about, but not listened to. In such conditions, a child begins to form an inner world far richer and more fragile than others realize, a sanctuary built of dreams and fears, fragile hopes and quiet doubts. Perhaps it was in these years that the earliest seeds of her later struggles took root, not through any single event, but through the gradual layering of an environment in which appearance overshadowed essence. It is often said that what shapes a person is not the dramatic crises, but the daily subtle erosion that occurs when affection is inconsistent and expectations endless. One might wonder what dreams the young Brenda held in those tender years before the glare of fame washed them away. Did she imagine a simpler life, free from scrutiny? Did she yearn for a sense of belonging that her fractured household could not offer? Or did she, even then, begin to internalize the idea that her value rested in her beauty, in her ability to embody the ideal of grace others projected upon her? Such questions hover like soft, unanswered echoes in the corners of her early story. And now, as the faint trace of perfume in the nursery begins to fade once more, we follow its dissolving trail into the next chapter of her life, where innocence slowly bends beneath the weight of expectation and the early turning points begin to gather. The last note of that dissolving perfume hangs in the air like the final wisp of a childhood that never fully had the chance to be lived. And as it scatters into the dimness, we find Brenda stepping quietly into the threshold between girlhood and the uncertain landscape that awaited her. There is something almost imperceptible about the moment when innocence first begins to loosen its hold, when the soft certainties of early years are gradually replaced by the awareness that one is being watched, judged, shaped. For Brenda, this turning point did not come with a dramatic event or a sudden loss, but with a slow accumulation of attention, a fascination from adults, strangers, and newspapers that grew around her as if she were a rare flower placed under glass. She began to sense that how she stood, how she smiled, how she moved through a room with quiet grace mattered more than how she felt inside. It was around this time that she first noticed the way conversations hushed when she entered, the way her mother's eyes lingered critically upon her posture, the way her father's approval came in brief flashes whenever she resembled the poised young lady he hoped the world would admire. This subtle shift, almost inaudible yet profoundly felt, became the invisible doorway into danger, though she could not yet see the shadows waiting beyond it. She was perhaps 12 or 13 when magazines began to feature her photograph, a surprising intrusion for one so young. But such was the fascination with social pedigree and beauty in a country newly enthralled by image. Photographers saw in her the budding charm of a future debutante, and society columnists found in her a symbol of a certain ideal, an ideal built not on accomplishment, but on lineage and appearance. It was a time when newspapers sought distractions from the country's deeper troubles, and young girls like Brenda became convenient muses. To the readers who clipped her pictures and whispered about her future, she was a distant figure, an emblem of privilege untouched by hardship. But to Brenda, these early intrusions into her private life were confusing, disconcerting, and strangely hollow. Praise was plentiful, yet none of it touched the tender places where a child hopes to be loved for who she truly is. Instead, admiration became something external, a reflection cast upon her rather than drawn from within. And as she grew older, she began to follow that reflection as if it were the only path available to her. Her mother, always aware of public perception, encouraged these early appearances, believing they paved the way for Brenda to become not simply a young woman of society, but a celebrated one. Perhaps she thought she was securing her daughter's future, ensuring she would be desired, admired, perhaps even envied. Yet intention does not shield a child from the weight of expectation, and Brenda found herself increasingly caught between the longing to please and the quiet ache of feeling unseen in the ways that mattered. She was praised for her beauty, her poise, her promise, but rarely for her thoughts or her tenderness or her curiosity. How many young hearts begin to fracture under such narrowly defined love? How early does a person begin to learn that who they are is less important than how they appear? In the quiet, unlit spaces between these public moments, Brenda often retreated into herself, finding solace in solitude rather than the company of those who misunderstood her silence as shyness or compliance. Observers saw a well-mannered, elegant young girl developing into a figure of remarkable grace, but they did not see the inner tremors, the uncertainty, the sense of standing on a precipice she did not choose. Even at that young age, she internalized the unspoken rule that her feelings were secondary to the image she was expected to uphold. And with each passing year, that image became more elaborate, more scrutinized, more confining. During her early adolescence, when most children experiment with identity in the safety of relative anonymity, Brenda's identity was already being assembled for her by others: journalists, socialites, photographers, even her own family. It is difficult for anyone, particularly the young, to resist a narrative crafted by the world around them, especially when that narrative brings admiration. Yet admiration without understanding is a brittle substance, offering brightness but little warmth. Brenda learned to navigate this terrain with a kind of instinctive caution, always aware that the wrong step, the wrong expression, the wrong moment of vulnerability might disrupt the fragile approval she had been taught to value. Still, beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. She noticed the way adults spoke of her, not as a girl but as a future spectacle. They spoke in terms of potential suitors, potential gowns, potential headlines. They spoke of debutante seasons and invitations and appearances as though they were not simply events, but obligations, pre-written chapters of a story she was expected to follow faithfully. Even before she understood the full significance of these expectations, she felt their heaviness. They hovered over her like ornate chandeliers, beautiful from a distance, but threatening when one stood directly beneath their weight. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world beyond her home began to shift. Photographs of her became more frequent. Articles speculated about her future, about the kind of woman she would become. Some described her as a rising beauty, others as a symbol of a new generation of social prominence. None described her as simply a girl finding her way, a girl shaped by a fractured home and a heart still longing for simple affection. With every new mention in the papers, she felt herself being pulled further into a narrative that was no longer her own. One cannot help but wonder what it feels like to be placed upon a pedestal before one even understands its height. Did she feel pride, confusion, fear? Perhaps all three, mingling in delicate, shifting proportions. Perhaps there were nights when she lay awake and imagined a life unlabeled, unseen, unpressured. Or perhaps by then she had already begun to believe that performance was her only path, that the admiration she received for her outward perfection was the closest she would come to belonging. At this early point, the danger was not yet visible to those around her. They saw charm, promise, beauty. They did not see how early adoration was entwining with insecurity, how quickly expectation was becoming dependence, how subtly the public gaze was shaping her sense of self. Yet these quiet beginnings contain within them the seeds of everything that would follow. The rise and the unraveling, the glitter and the loneliness, the acclaim and the ache. And now, as the soft echo of those early magazine pages fades, like thin paper curling at the edges with time, we move toward the chapter where her ascent into national fascination begins to quicken, where the spotlight grows brighter than any child should endure, and where the shadows accompanying that brilliance begin to take their shape. The last whisper of those early magazine pages seems to drift backward into silence, curling softly into the corners of memory, and from that delicate quiet we step into the gathering light of Brenda Frazier's rise, a light that did not illuminate so much as it surrounded her with an intensity she never sought. If one imagines the world in which she was now blooming, it becomes clear that her ascent was not a sudden leap, but a slow, shimmering expansion of attention, like the widening ripple of a stone dropped into still water. America, entering the late 1930s, was navigating a fragile balance between glamour and uncertainty. The Great Depression had stolen years of ease, and yet the public clung to the notion that elegance still existed somewhere, that beauty and refinement could still be found above the hardships of the day. In such a climate, society pages became a kind of refuge, a place where readers could escape into a realm of gowns, jewels, and graceful figures who seemed untouched by the turbulence of the era. It was into this landscape that Brenda stepped, not by choice but by circumstance, guided by the ambitions of others who believed they understood what her future should be. Her mother, with an eye keenly trained on reputation and status, saw the growing interest in Brenda not as a burden but as an opportunity. Perhaps she believed she was giving her daughter a gift, preparing her for a life that would ensure admiration and security. Yet admiration, when unearned by one's inner self, can erode rather than uplift, and Brenda, still tender, still seeking stability, found herself caught in the tightening circle of expectations that surrounded her every gesture. Invitations began to arrive from distant cities, requests for her presence at luncheons, teas, charity events. She was no longer just a girl from a fractured home. She was becoming a young woman the public believed they recognized from afar. Each appearance fed the growing narrative that she was destined for spectacular debut. And with each mention in the press, her image expanded beyond her control, growing brighter, louder, more defined than she ever felt inside. The debutante season loomed like a distant but inevitable summit, one that society expected her to reach with flawless grace. Unlike other girls who might anticipate their coming out ball with excitement or nervous joy, Brenda approached it with a sense of detachment, as though it were a performance pre-written for her long before she could decide whether she wished to take part. Friends and acquaintances marveled at the attention she drew, speaking admiringly of her delicate features, her quiet demeanor, her perfect suitability for the spotlight that awaited her. But beneath these surface assessments lay a truth known only to those who looked closely, that she carried within her a profound unease, an uncertainty about what was expected of her, and an even deeper question about who she was allowed to be beneath the image others adored. Journalists often described her as ethereal, graceful, reserved. Yet these observations were taken not from any true understanding, but from moments frozen by cameras, moments that captured stillness rather than thought, posture rather than feeling. When newspapers began calling her the Girl of the Year, the nation's most celebrated debutante, the pressure surrounding her grew not gradually but exponentially. Her photograph appeared everywhere. Magazines, society columns, even national publications that seldom focused on debutantes. Her beauty became a public commodity, her name synonymous with the glamour that many believed represented the last flicker of old-world elegance before the world shifted once more toward uncertainty and war. But for Brenda, this sudden attention did not bring a sense of belonging. Instead, it deepened her feeling of isolation, for the more she was admired, the less she felt understood. Preparations for her debutante ball consumed nearly every waking moment. Tailors prepared gowns with painstaking detail, hairdressers crafted styles meant to embody perfection, and planners coordinated the event with a grandeur rarely seen even among New York's elite. Her mother hovered over each decision, determined that nothing tarnish her daughter's moment. Brenda moved through these preparations politely, obediently, but internally she drifted further from herself, her thoughts quiet, heavy, and unspoken. It is perhaps in these moments that we see the earliest signs of a fracture forming beneath her polished exterior, a fracture that would widen with time. For a girl who craved gentleness, the relentless focus on her appearance must have felt like a constant reminder that her true self, whatever it might have been, was invisible, eclipsed entirely by the flawless image she was being asked to embody. The night of the debutante ball is remembered as a glittering spectacle, the kind of event that becomes legend in the circles that cherish such memories. Hundreds attended, photographers crowded the entrance, flashes lit the ballroom like small artificial stars. It was, by every public measure, a triumph. Yet triumph achieved in the name of others rarely nourishes the one who must perform it. As Brenda stepped into the room, dressed in a gown whose pale fabric shimmered like frost, she seemed the very embodiment of society's dream, a dream that looked delicate and perfect from afar, but carried within it the silent weight of expectation pressing upon her narrow shoulders. Guests gasped as she descended the staircase. Admirers whispered of her breathtaking beauty. Journalists scribbled furiously, certain that this moment would become part of the cultural tapestry of the era. But what did Brenda herself feel as she moved through the crowd, offering smiles that felt rehearsed, accepting compliments that sounded hollow, navigating conversations that revolved around everything except her inner world? Some say she felt nothing at all, as if she were watching herself from a distance. Others believe she felt a deep sadness, a loneliness sharpened by the contrast between the grandeur around her and the emptiness within. Photographs from that night show her serene, composed, radiant, yet close inspection reveals an undertone of stillness that borders on detachment, as though she were suspended between the demands of the moment and some unreachable part of herself that longed for quiet and authenticity. This event marked the pinnacle of her rise, the point at which the public's fascination with her transformed from interest into obsession. Reporters followed her every appearance. Young women copied her hairstyle and clothing. Society gossiped endlessly about her suitors, her diet, her demeanor. She had become, in the span of one night, less a person than a symbol, an icon of beauty, poise, and refinement. And yet symbols cannot breathe. They cannot falter. They cannot express fear or fatigue or longing. The more she was adored, the more she was confined, and the more she was confined, the more the shadows accompanying her rise gathered quietly at the edges of her life. One wonders, when she returned home from that luminous night, whether she paused at her mirror once more, searching her reflection not for beauty, but for the small traces of self she feared were slipping away. Did she recognize the girl who looked back at her? Or did she see only the silhouette of the figure others believed her to be? Did she feel the thrill of achievement? Or did she sense the first touch of despair, knowing that no amount of public admiration could fill the quiet spaces within her that still longed for belonging? As the last whispers of that brilliant night fade, leaving behind only the glimmer of chandeliers dimming slowly into darkness, we follow the quiet footsteps Brenda left behind as she walked deeper into a world where fame, once bright and intoxicating, began to reveal the darker shadows waiting behind its glow. The chandeliers of that celebrated ballroom had scarcely cooled before the glow that surrounded Brenda began to harden into something sharper, something less forgiving, something that clung to her with a persistence she could neither escape nor fully understand. In the days and months following her fame debut, the world that had once seemed merely watchful now became ravenous, its hunger directed toward every movement she made, every expression that flickered across her delicate face, every detail of her life that could be stretched, repeated, embellished, and consumed by an audience far larger than the people who had danced beside her that glittering night. If her rise had been a steady illumination, brightening gently with each step, her collapse came as the quiet aftermath, slow, creeping, obscured by the very light that first made her visible. And yet, as with many tragedies that unfold under elegance, it did not begin with a shatter, but with small tremors, barely perceptible at first, echoing through her days in ways too subtle for observers to recognize, but too relentless for her to ignore. The attention did not subside after the ball. It grew, multiplied, pressed upon her with a force she could never have anticipated. Reporters lingered near her home, photographers trailed her at luncheons, and columnists speculated endlessly about her wardrobe, her companions, her future. To the public, this fascination seemed harmless, even flattering, a tribute to her beauty and refinement. Yet for Brenda, the scrutiny was suffocating. She had never sought fame. She had never designed a life that revolved around being watched. She was thrust into it, and the suddenness of its intensity disoriented her, as though she were being swept along by a river whose current grew stronger with each day, carrying her further from the quiet places where she once sought refuge. Even within her own family, she found little comfort. Her mother praised the attention, encouraging her daughter to maintain her immaculate image, while her father viewed the public fascination with remote interest, neither shielding her from it nor acknowledging the burden it placed upon her. Her inner world, already fragile from the instability of her childhood, began to tremble under the weight of these expectations. Those around her noticed the changes only indirectly, the way she grew quieter in conversation, the way her smiles seemed increasingly practiced, the way her posture stiffened as though bracing against some invisible pressure, and behind closed doors, her struggles deepened. She became acutely aware of her appearance, striving to maintain the perfection others expected, even as her own sense of self slipped further away. Meals became a battleground, her appetite diminished not by vanity but by anxiety, by the feeling that every bite would be measured against her public image, judged by eyes that never truly saw her. Her health began to falter, but in a world that prized poise above authenticity, the early signs of collapse were mistaken for refinement. A more slender figure, a more ethereal presence, a more delicate silhouette gliding through rooms where she felt increasingly out of place. Her relationships, too, suffered under the weight of scrutiny and insecurity. Young men courted her, drawn not to the girl beneath the surface, but to the icon they had seen in newspapers. Their admiration felt distant, ceremonial, something recited rather than felt. Companionship, which she yearned for quietly and deeply, became yet another performance, another arena where she feared disappointment, rejection, or disapproval. Perhaps she hoped that love might anchor her, offering the steadiness she had lacked since childhood, but love that is pursued through fear often slips away like smoke. Each failed connection deepened her loneliness, leaving her more exposed to the unrelenting demands of the public eye. As her emotional state grew more fragile, the world continued to expect radiance from her. Invitations increased, photographers pressed closer, and society's expectations grew heavier. Newspapers reported her slightest movements, her presence at a cafe, her expression at an event, her absence from a gathering, as though these details held cosmic significance. But she, standing amid this whirlwind, felt only the growing distance between the person she appeared to be and the person she feared she truly was. Uncertain, unseen, yearning for softness in a world that demanded brilliance. It was around this time that her struggle with disordered eating began to deepen, though such matters were seldom spoken of openly in her era. The public admired her increasingly slender figure, mistaking fragility for glamour, unaware that it was a manifestation of inner turmoil rather than deliberate artistry. She felt trapped between the pressure to maintain her image and the quiet despair that gnawed at her from within. A despair born not only from scrutiny, but from a deeper question that whispered to her in the quiet hours. Who was she, aside from the reflection crafted for public consumption? Each day the answer grew less clear. Each day, she felt herself slipping further from the innocence of her youth and deeper into the hollow space carved out by others' expectations. Her emotional collapse was not swift. It unfolded slowly, elegantly, tragically, veiled by the grace she had been trained to display. Those close to her saw only glimpses, the dimming of her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands, the way her voice softened when speaking of her hopes, as though she feared even her own dreams might betray her. She withdrew from social gatherings at times, citing fatigue, though the fatigue she carried was not of the body alone. It was a tiredness of spirit, of standing beneath a spotlight that offered no warmth, of being known by everyone yet understood by no one. And as loneliness settled over her with increasing weight, she found herself reaching for affection in places that offered only fleeting solace. Romantic entanglements provided momentary escape, but left her feeling more adrift, for they were built upon the persona she had never meant to create, not the self she longed to reveal. Each disappointment strengthened her belief that she was unworthy of genuine love, that the admiration she received was conditional, fragile, and ultimately hollow. And so, she retreated further into herself, her world narrowing until even the brightest rooms seemed dim. The collapse of her emotional well-being, though mostly hidden from public view, was the inevitable outcome of a life that had been shaped more by others' desires than by her own. Fame, which seemed so luminous from the outside, became a cage, one whose bars were invisible yet unbreakable, forged from the weight of expectation, the fear of imperfection, and the aching absence of a stable self. And within this cage, Brenda drifted further into despair, her once bright image now shadowed by the quiet realities she bore alone. And now, as we reach the end of this part, we linger on a small, haunting image. A telephone ringing softly in the corner of her room, unanswered, its sound fading into the quiet as she sits alone, wondering how a life so admired could feel so deeply empty. The soft ringing of that unanswered telephone seems to stretch across a long and silent corridor, its echo thinning into nothingness as we step into the part of Brenda's story where truth grows complicated, where the polished surface of her public identity flickers and reveals faint fractures beneath. These fractures were always present, but now, with the luminous height of her fame behind her and the quiet decline beginning its slow drift, they become more visible, more revealing, more painful to contemplate. History often remembers Brenda as the quintessential debutante, a symbol of an age obsessed with glamour, beauty, and spectacle. Yet the truths that threaded through her life were far more intricate than the pages of society columns ever suggested. It is here, in these dimmer hallways of her past, that we encounter the controversial realities often softened, omitted, or misunderstood by those who preferred the simplicity of her image over the complexity of her humanity. One of these truths lies in the roles her parents played, not as villains but as participants in a pattern difficult to fully untangle. Her mother, so often portrayed as ambitious and controlling, had indeed placed Brenda on a social pedestal long before the girl could understand its height. Yet beneath the ambition lay a kind of desperation born from her own insecurities, from the pressures of social expectation, and from a deep fear of losing relevance in a world that valued youth above all else. She shaped Brenda's early public presence not solely out of vanity, as some later accounts implied, but from her own longing for significance, for belonging, for a place in a society that judged women harshly and allowed them even fewer avenues for recognition. Perhaps she believed that grooming Brenda into the perfect debutante was an act of love, a way to give her daughter a foundation stronger than the one she herself had received. But intentions, even when rooted in affection, can become distorted when filtered through unresolved wounds. And the love she offered Brenda was often tangled with pressure, criticism, and the relentless demand for perfection. Her father, meanwhile, has often been cast as distant, a man too reserved to offer the warmth his daughter craved. Yet the truth is more nuanced. His emotional distance was not born from indifference, but from the culture he had inherited. A lineage of restraint, of quiet suffering, of emotional stoicism passed down through generations of Boston families who believed that dignity required silence, composure, and the suppression of anything resembling vulnerability. He adored Brenda in his own muted way, but he had never been taught how to express tenderness, how to offer reassurance, how to anchor a child who lived beneath scrutiny. Perhaps he did not fully understand her loneliness. Perhaps he believed that providing for her materially was enough. But children, especially sensitive ones, seek something far deeper, the assurance that they matter for reasons independent of the world's gaze. That assurance was a language he did not know how to speak, and so the gap between them widened quietly, sadly, without either fully grasping the depth of its impact. Another truth, rarely discussed, concerns the emotional environment surrounding Brenda during her adolescence. The quiet, corrosive effects of being perceived as a commodity rather than a child. The media, in its early fascination with her budding beauty, contributed to a narrative that robbed her of normality. This narrative carried implicit messages that she existed to be looked at, admired, discussed, and that her worth depended entirely on her ability to uphold the expectations projected upon her. In this sense, Brenda was among the earliest casualties of a form of celebrity culture that would eventually become commonplace, one in which young women are turned into icons before they have the chance to understand themselves, one in which beauty becomes both shield and weapon, one in which the line between attention and exploitation blurs. She was also, as many never acknowledged openly, deeply vulnerable to the influence of those who saw in her a path to their own desires. Some companions were drawn to her name and visibility rather than to her spirit. Some sought her approval for what it could grant them socially. Others, seeing her fragility, offered her fleeting intimacy that left her more hollow than before. What the public interpreted as glamorous social life was, at times, a landscape filled with manipulation, superficiality, and emotional risk. Those who circle the shining light of public attention often do so to warm themselves, not to protect the one standing at its center. Brenda, longing for genuine affection, often reached for connections that could not sustain her. The world admired her beauty, but rarely bothered to consider the tenderness of her heart, the delicacy of her inner world, or the loneliness that deepened as her fame grew. History also glosses over the severity of her struggles with food and body image, treating them as footnotes in a glamorous story, rather than as central forces shaping her life. But these struggles were not mere reactions to social pressure. They were rooted in a deeper sense of inadequacy, formed long before the public saw her as an icon. Her eating disorder was not about beauty, it was about control. Control over a world that demanded perfection, control over a public identity she had not chosen, control over a life where decisions were often made for her, not with her. And as her eating habits grew increasingly restrictive, the public did not see illness. They saw refinement. They praised her slenderness without recognizing the suffering that produced it. They admired her delicacy without hearing the quiet cry for help hidden behind it. Then there is the truth about her so-called glamour. How much of it was constructed, imposed, or encouraged by forces that valued spectacle over selfhood? Photographers arranged her poses. Stylists selected her clothing. Editors chose her descriptors. The public believed they were adoring Brenda, but they were adoring a carefully curated image, one crafted from fragments of reality polished into portraiture. What did that mean for the girl who had to wear this image every day? How did it feel to know that the world admired a version of her that never fully aligned with the person she felt herself to be? And so, the controversial truth emerges quietly. Brenda was not destroyed by fame alone, but by the collision of internal fragility and external forces too powerful for one person to withstand. She was a symbol to some, a spectacle to others, and a possession to those who sought to shape her. But she was also a soul caught in a storm of expectations, longing for a form of love that might steady her amidst the whirlwind. As this part draws to a close, we are left with the soft image of Brenda sitting beside a window on a late evening, the curtains barely stirring, the city humming distantly below. She watches the lights flicker, unsure whether they comfort or torment her, and wonders quietly what part of her story truly belongs to her at all, and what part has been claimed by a world that never truly knew her. The faint glow of those flickering city lights fades slowly, and from their dim retreat we step into the final quiet chapters of Brenda's life, where the weight of years settled differently upon her than it had during the season of her fame. The applause that had once surrounded her had long since dwindled, leaving only the soft rustle of memory, and in that space, she was no longer the emblem of a generation's fascination, but a woman moving through days marked by fragility, introspection, and an ache that seemed to hover like a pale mist around the edges of her existence. Her life, once orchestrated with precision by society's expectations, had transformed into something far more uncertain, shaped less by the gaze of others and more by the lingering shadows of her own internal battles. These were the years when she sought refuge in the quietest corners, when her attempts to reclaim a sense of self met the stubborn residue of earlier wounds, and when the world that had once adored her seemed scarcely aware that she still lived within it. The passing decades did not bring Brenda the stability she had long craved. The glamour of her youth, so heavily publicized, faded with a swiftness that exposed the fragility of fame built on beauty. For some, such a transformation might have offered liberation, an escape from the relentless scrutiny that shaped their early lives. But for Brenda, whose identity had been molded almost entirely from the reflections others cast upon her, the disappearance of public attention did not free her. It unmoored her. She had been defined for so long by her image that its dissolution left her with a hollow uncertainty, a profound question about who she was without the spotlight that had once imprisoned and validated her in equal measure. The world continued its march forward, creating new icons, new obsessions, new symbols of glamour, and Brenda quietly slipped into the background, unnoticed except by those few who remained close enough to see the quiet unraveling of her spirit. Her health, long undermined by years of disordered eating, emotional strain, and the psychological toll of early fame, deteriorated steadily. There were stretches of time when she attempted to rebuild her life, seeking help, pursuing treatment, or exploring new ways to find meaning beyond the roles she had once performed. But progress often came in fragile moments, easily scattered by the resurgence of old habits and the shadows of insecurities that had followed her since childhood. The loneliness she felt during these years was of a particular kind, a loneliness born not from lack of company, but from the absence of understanding. Few could comprehend the depth of her struggles, for her pain had always been hidden behind a veil of elegance, and even those who tried to help her often did so from a place of pity rather than true empathy. There were friendships, yes, and occasional connections that offered temporary comfort, but Brenda, ever sensitive to the intentions of others, often sensed that these bonds were tinged with the residue of her faded notoriety. She longed deeply for companionship unclouded by expectation, for a love rooted in authenticity rather than in the ghost of her once famous image. Yet love, for her, remained elusive, slipping through her hands like water no matter how gently she tried to hold it. Those who entered her life sometimes found themselves overwhelmed by the emotional fragility she carried, unsure how to offer support without becoming entangled in the complexities of her inner world. And so, despite moments of promise, many relationships dissolved quietly, leaving her still searching for connection in rooms that felt increasingly empty. Her later years were marked by financial strain as well, a reality rarely acknowledged in the glamorous accounts of her youth. The wealth that had framed her early life did not endure. Poor investments, shifting family fortunes, and the ongoing costs of medical and psychological care left her navigating a world far removed from the opulence of her debutante days. There is a quiet irony in the fact that a woman once held as the symbol of privilege and abundance spent her final decades confronting scarcity, not just of money, but of stability, confidence, and the affection she had once believed fame would secure. Yet even in these struggles, she carried a certain fragile dignity, a gentleness shaped not by societal expectations, but by her own quiet resilience. She lived much of her later life in seclusion, finding solace in the small, predictable rhythms of her days. The clamor of society events was long behind her, replaced by the hush of modest living spaces, by the presence of caregivers, and by the fading echoes of memories she had never fully reconciled. There were times when she reflected openly on her past, speaking with a kind of wistful clarity about the pressures she had faced and the misunderstandings that had shaped her public persona. She recognized, with a mixture of sadness and acceptance, that the world had never truly known her, only the version of her that had been placed beneath the shimmering lights of youth. And yet, there were also moments when she seemed to drift into a kind of sorrow that words could not fully express, when the weight of all she had endured pressed upon her too heavily for speech. Her death in 1982 did not spark the flurry of attention that had defined her debut. It passed quietly, acknowledged by a few who still remembered the pale young woman who had once enchanted the nation. There was no grand farewell, no final lavish tribute, only a brief flurry of articles recalling her iconic beauty and the circumstances that had marked her decline. But even in death, the complexity of her life remained largely obscured, distilled into a simplistic narrative of rise and fall, of glamour followed by tragedy, as though these two poles could capture the depth of her humanity. The truth, gentle and painful, was far more intricate. She had been worn down not by one great catastrophe, but by years of subtle erasure, by the relentless pressure to reflect an image she could not sustain, by the absence of emotional grounding, by the unkindness of a world that valued her for qualities she could not carry forever. As we linger in this part of her story, picturing the quiet stillness that enclosed her final years, we are left with the tender ache of a life remembered not in the brightness of its beginning, but in the fragility of its end. And perhaps it is in this fragility that one finds the most human truth of all. How deeply we all long to be seen beyond our surfaces. How desperately we seek the kind of love that recognizes the soul rather than the silhouette. In the dimming light of her final chapter, Brenda lived with the knowledge that she had been adored by many but understood by few, and it is this quiet reality that lends her story its enduring poignancy. Now, as the soft lamplight in her small room flickers and settles into stillness, we step lightly into the next part of her story, where memory, legacy, and misinterpretation intertwine, shaping the ways she is recalled by the generations that followed. The lamplight in that quiet room dims further, settling into a hush that seems almost reverent, and from this soft stillness, we drift into the realm where memory and misinterpretation entwine, forming the legacy the world chose for Brenda Frazier. One that reflects her only in fragments, like a mirror tarnished by time. The years that followed her passing brought no grand reassessment of her life, no thoughtful examination of the forces that had shaped her, no gentle reweaving of the truth she had once struggled to live beneath. Instead, history, swift, selective, prone to simplification, preserved her as a symbol rather than a soul, an emblem of a fleeting era's obsession with glamour, youth, and spectacle. Yet legacies like stories told beside a fading fire carry echoes both true and untrue. And it is within these echoes that the misunderstanding of her life took shape, whispering across decades with the persistence of a half-remembered dream. In the public imagination, Brenda remained suspended in the shimmering moment of her debutante ball, forever the pale, graceful girl descending the marble staircase beneath the eyes of a nation. That one night, captured in photographs and repeated endlessly in society pages, overshadowed everything that came before and everything that followed. Many remembered her not as a woman who lived a full human life marked by longing, complexity, and sorrow, but as a single glittering image, the debutante of debutantes, the girl of the year, the embodiment of a tradition that was already beginning to fray at its edges. Her later struggles, her internal fragility, her attempts to reclaim herself were folded into the narrative only as melancholy footnotes, as if the suffering that marked her adulthood were merely the inevitable fading of a once luminous star. But her story was far more than a simple arc of rise and fall. It was the quiet tale of someone who had been shaped by forces she could not control, whose identity had been rewritten by others long before she had the chance to write it herself. Even now, many recall her only through the lens of glamour. The lavish gowns, the opulent ball, the press coverage that made her a national fascination. But this focus reveals more about the society that created her than about Brenda herself. She became a vessel into which the public poured its desires, a symbol of beauty during difficult times, a reminder of elegance in an age of uncertainty, a living reassurance that refinement still existed somewhere beyond the shadows of economic hardship and impending war. It is easy to remember her as an icon because icons require no understanding, no empathy, no acknowledgement of the complex human beneath the veneer. They can be admired from a distance, interpreted through convenience, preserved as a simple story that satisfies an appetite for nostalgia. But Brenda was never simple, and the reduction of her life into a shimmering symbol obscures the quiet truths that defined her: vulnerability, yearning, the painful pursuit of a self she never fully found. Her legacy also reveals the consequences of a culture that glorifies youth while neglecting the emotional well-being of those placed on pedestals. Brenda was one of the earliest young women to be turned into a media phenomenon, not for accomplishment or talent, but for social position and appearance. In many ways, she was a precursor to the modern celebrity, subject to the same distortions, pressures, and invasions of privacy that would later shape the lives of countless others. The misunderstandings surrounding her life serve as a reminder that public fascination often conceals private suffering and that the narratives constructed for entertainment rarely reflect the truth of the individuals caught within them. Her struggles with mental health, her battle with eating disorders, her longing for genuine connection, her enduring loneliness, these aspects of her experience were rarely acknowledged in her time and remain understated even now, overshadowed by the glamorous facade that continues to define her in collective memory. Yet beyond the public's misconceptions, another part of her legacy resides in the quiet impact her story has had on those willing to look deeper. Writers, historians, and gentle observers have found in Brenda a poignant emblem of the human cost of societal expectation. She has become a symbol not only of glamour but of its consequences, a cautionary tale about the fragility of identity when shaped by external forces rather than internal truth. Some see her as a tragic figure whose life highlights the dangers of valuing appearance over well-being, while others view her with compassion, recognizing in her the universal longing to be seen, understood, and loved for one's true self. Her life invites reflection on the ways society constructs and consumes public figures, on the loneliness that can accompany admiration, and on the quiet tragedies that unfold behind closed doors, while the world applauds the image standing in the spotlight. The misremembering of Brenda also extends to the era she symbolized. The golden image of high society debutantes often obscures the rigid expectations, emotional pressures, and social hierarchies that shape their lives. Her story, when viewed more closely, reveals the limitations of such a world, the sacrifices demanded of young women, the suppression of individuality in favor of conformity, the emotional costs of maintaining appearances. In this light, Brenda becomes not merely a participant in that culture, but a reflection of its flaws. Her life illuminating the cracks in a system that prized perfection above authenticity. She stands as a reminder that beauty, when valued above all else, can become a burden too heavy to bear. If history has misremembered her, it is perhaps because the truth of her story is quieter than the spectacle that once surrounded her. It requires patience, tenderness, and a willingness to look beyond the polished surface. It asks us to imagine the girl behind the headlines, the woman behind the myth, the human behind the silhouette. And when we do, her legacy takes on a different shape, one marked by empathy rather than fascination, by understanding rather than reduction, by a recognition of the delicate strength she possessed, even as she struggled beneath the weight of expectations that would have crushed many. As we linger in this reflection, imagining her memory drifting through time like a thin veil stirred by a passing breeze, we sense the unresolved nature of her story, the lingering questions that hover softly around her name. And from this quiet contemplation, we move toward the next chapter, where the mirror of her public image shifts once more, revealing new angles, new shadows, and new insights into the way she has been remembered and misremembered across generations. The veil of memory that drifts across Brenda's legacy settles for a moment, catching a faint, trembling shimmer like the glint of light on glass. And from this fragile radiance, a new image emerges, one fixed not in the glow of chandeliers or the flicker of flashbulbs, but in the reflective silence that follows them. For in this next part of her story, we find ourselves standing before the mirror that followed Brenda everywhere she went, a mirror that both revealed and obscured, flattered and distorted, comforted and betrayed. It was a constant presence in her life, from the carefully arranged photographs of her adolescence to the opulent vanity tables of her debutante years, and later to the dim, modest rooms where she sought refuge from a world that no longer remembered her. This mirror, both literal and symbolic, became an unspoken companion through her rise and decline, a surface that captured her shifting reflection while quietly shaping the way she saw herself. And it is here, in the delicate interplay between her true reflection and the one the world projected onto her, that we uncover the deeper meaning behind the image she was forced to inhabit. In her youth, the mirror had been a source of fascination, as it is for many young girls. It reflected her smooth features, her wide eyes, her pale skin, qualities that adults around her praised with a consistency that made her believe, even before she understood the weight of their words, that her value lay in those delicate attributes. But as she grew older, the mirror took on a more commanding presence, becoming not a simple object, but an arbiter of worth, a silent judge that echoed the expectations others placed upon her. Every morning she faced herself in its surface, examining not only her appearance, but the unspoken demands that clung to it. Was she slender enough? Graceful enough? Perfect enough to satisfy the eyes that watched her from afar? Each reflection became a moment of reckoning, a subtle negotiation between who she felt herself to be and who she believed she needed to become. During the height of her fame, the mirror became intertwined with performance. She learned to adopt the expressions others expected, to smooth her features into practiced serenity, to hold herself in ways that aligned with the image constructed for her by society and the press. She was praised for her poise, for her ability to embody elegance without effort, yet beneath that elegance lay an unspoken fear that any deviation from perfection would invite disapproval, scrutiny, or rejection. The mirror reinforced this fear, offering approval only when she adhered to the rigid standards imposed upon her. It reflected the perfection she was taught to display, while concealing the imperfections she longed in quiet moments to reveal. But mirrors, like memories, hold more than one truth. They reflect what stands before them, yes, but they also reveal what is missing, what cannot be captured in the smoothness of a surface. As Brenda grew more aware of the gap between her inner self and her public image, she began to see that the reflection she had spent years perfecting bore little resemblance to the woman she felt herself becoming. It was a reflection shaped by photographers, columnists, socialites, and admirers, an image constructed and cultivated until it took on a life of its own, one that overshadowed her true identity. And yet, even as she recognized this disconnect, she found herself unable to step away from the reflection that others preferred. The mirror had become both her shield and her prison, a place where she sought validation and where she felt the deepest ache of inadequacy. In her later years, the mirror's power changed. It no longer reflected a face celebrated by the world. It reflected a woman marked by sorrow, illness, and the quiet erosion of hope. It showed the physical toll of her struggles, the fragility that had always existed beneath the surface, but had been masked by the glamour of youth. These reflections were difficult for her to face, not because they revealed imperfection, but because they exposed the vulnerability that had always lived within her, now stripped of the illusions that once concealed it. Yet in these moments, when she gazed at herself with the honesty of solitude, there was a kind of truth the world had never allowed her to embrace, a truth that spoke not of elegance or spectacle, but of humanity. This shift in how she viewed herself remains one of the more poignant aspects of her story. The world had long defined her through a single lens, reducing her to a symbol of beauty, a representative of a fleeting era's idealized femininity. But Brenda, especially in her later years, saw herself differently. She saw her fragility, yes, but also her tenderness, her longing for affection, her capacity for introspection. These were qualities that had been overshadowed by the image imposed upon her, yet they were the essence of who she was beneath it all. The mirror that once reflected only the expectations of others now offered her a glimpse of her own truth, however painful it might have been. Her relationship with her reflection also speaks to a broader theme within her life: how society's gaze shapes the identities of those placed beneath its scrutiny. The public saw in Brenda what they wanted to see: beauty, refinement, elegance. They did not see the internal battles, the quiet suffering, the moments of doubt and despair that no photograph could capture. And in this way, the mirror becomes a metaphor for the collective illusion surrounding her, an illusion maintained not only by the images published of her, but by the willingness of the public to accept those images as the entirety of her being. It is easier, after all, to admire a surface than to acknowledge the complexities beneath it. Yet the mirror also reveals something more subtle: how deeply Brenda internalized the gaze of others, how she began to evaluate her worth through their eyes rather than her own. This internalization is one of the quiet tragedies of her story, for it meant that even in solitude, she could not fully escape the expectations that had shaped her. She carried them within her, reflected in the mirror long after the public had turned its attention elsewhere. And so, her relationship with her reflection remained fraught, filled with longing for recognition and fear of inadequacy, even as she aged and the world's gaze shifted to younger faces. In contemplating the mirror's role in her life, one is left with the image of Brenda standing alone before it in a dimly lit room, the light catching the edges of her face in a way that softens the harshness of time. She gazes quietly at her reflection, searching not for beauty but for evidence of the self she once hoped to grow into, a self unbound by expectation, unshadowed by the gaze of strangers. Perhaps she finds it for a moment, flickering like a candle in the dark. Perhaps she does not. But the image remains, suspended in a stillness that carries both tenderness and sorrow. And now, as we leave that quiet reflection behind, we drift into the next part of her story, where the echoes of her family, their expectations, and the unspoken tensions shaping her early life gather once more, casting long shadows across the path she walked. The soft glimmer of the mirror's reflection fades into dusk, and as the last trace of light withdraws from its surface, we find ourselves stepping once more into the deeper chambers of Brenda's past, where the echoes of her family linger like faint footsteps in a hallway long abandoned. These echoes are neither loud nor clear. They are subdued, softened by time, yet unmistakably present in every part of the life she would one day live. For no rise to prominence, no collapse into despair, begins in isolation. It begins in the quiet corners of childhood, where expectations become shadows, where silences carry weight, where affection is measured not by warmth, but by what others believe a child should become. And so we return to those early rooms, tinted with memory, to understand the ancestral threads that bound Brenda long before the world knew her name. The Frazier and Warden families from which she descended were steeped in history, prestige, and a kind of rigid poise that seemed to pass from generation to generation, like an heirloom that could not be refused. These families were part of a world where wealth was old, where lineage determined one's place in society, where reputation functioned as both armor and restraint. To be born into such a family was to inherit a script already written, and Brenda entered this script as though stepping onto a stage before she had learned to speak. Her parents, with their own wounds, insecurities, and unspoken disappointments, moved through this world carrying the weight of expectations placed upon them by generations past, and Brenda, as their only child, became the vessel into which they poured their hopes, fears, and unresolved longings. Her mother, the striking Brenda Germain Warden, had grown up navigating a society that prized appearance as much as character, if not more. She learned early that beauty was a currency, and she wielded it skillfully, though not always confidently. Her own marriage had been strained by conflicting temperaments, differing ambitions, and the pressures of preserving a facade of stability. When she looked at her daughter, she saw not only the child she loved, but the reflection of what she hoped might secure the place she had struggled to maintain. It is easy in the softened view of memory to judge her ambition harshly, yet one must imagine her as a woman shaped by a culture that left her few avenues for validation beyond the admiration of others. She taught Brenda what she knew, that beauty brought favor, that grace invited admiration, that perfection was not merely desirable, but necessary. However, unintentionally, she passed down her own anxieties, her perfectionism, and her longing for approval, not in words, but in the way she hovered near her daughter's mirror, the way she corrected her posture, the way she tightened a ribbon or smoothed a strand of hair that dared fall out of place. Brenda's father, Frank Frazier, belonged to a lineage defined by reserve, propriety, and emotional austerity. He was a man formed by expectation rather than introspection, someone who carried the weight of his ancestry like a vestige of identity that left little room for emotional expression. To him, providing materially was synonymous with love, and so he ensured that his daughter wanted for nothing, except perhaps the tenderness she so deeply craved. His affection was muted, almost hidden, yet not absent. He cared for Brenda in the way he had been taught to care, with gestures rather than words, with presence rather than intimacy. But the gulf between the love he felt and the way he expressed it left Brenda uncertain, longing for reassurance he did not know how to give. In a different world, where vulnerability was permitted and emotional openness encouraged, he might have been a different father. But in the world he inherited, softness was seen as weakness, And so he offered steadiness where he needed to offer warmth, silence where he needed to offer support, distance where he needed to offer closeness. Between these two forces, the mother who shaped her through scrutiny and the father who shaped her through absence, Brenda learned to navigate a landscape of expectations that formed a kind of emotional labyrinth. She became attuned to the slightest shifts in tone, the smallest gestures, the quiet tensions that hovered in the spaces between words. Children raised in such environments often develop a deep sensitivity, a capacity to perceive what is unspoken, and Brenda's later struggles can be traced to this early attunement, which heightened her vulnerability to external judgment. She learned early that love could be conditional, that approval could evaporate with a single misstep, that being admired was not the same as being understood. The house in which she spent her earliest years bore the imprint of her family's contradictions, rooms filled with elegant furnishings, yet marked by emotional coldness, hallways that carried the scent of polished wood, yet echoed with unspoken frustrations, gatherings that glittered with social prestige, yet lacked true intimacy. These spaces shaped her sense of belonging, her understanding of safety, her earliest perceptions of self. Even the silence of the house held meaning, a silence not of tranquility but of tension, a stillness punctuated by the soft closing of doors and the distant rustle of grown-up voices speaking in guarded tones. She grew up within these muted walls, internalizing their atmosphere, carrying it with her even as she stepped into the world beyond. Family gatherings often brought with them the weight of expectation, as relatives observed her with approving nods or faintly critical glances. They saw in her the continuation of their lineage, the embodiment of their ideals. Their compliments were often laden with subtext. Such a lovely girl, so poised already, a proper young lady. Phrases that seemed warm on the surface, yet carried the chilling implication that any deviation from these qualities would be cause for concern. Brenda absorbed these messages quietly, understanding long before she could articulate it that her value, in the eyes of her family, was tied to the image she projected. It is little wonder, then, that she learned to measure herself through the reflections of others, for those reflections had been her compass since childhood. The divorce of her parents further intensified these dynamics, fracturing her sense of stability at an age when stability is the foundation upon which identity is built. She became the silent witness to their disagreements, the delicate thread pulled taut between two lives that no longer intertwined. In such circumstances, children often feel compelled to compensate, to become the source of harmony in a world that feels unsteady. Brenda sought to be pleasing, to be perfect, to be a balm for the wounds she could sense in her parents, but could not heal. This role, assumed so early, would follow her throughout her life, shaping her interactions, her relationships, her sense of self. She learned to smile even when she was aching, to appear serene even when she was uncertain, to suppress her needs for fear that they might burden those she loved. The deeper truth of Brenda's early years lies not in the social pedigree she inherited, but in the emotional inheritance she could not escape. She inherited longing from her mother, silence from her father, expectation from her lineage, and fragility from the unspoken pressures that swirled around her childhood. These forces, subtle yet powerful, formed the foundation upon which her later struggles would build. They created the emotional architecture of her life, the walls of perfection, the windows of scrutiny, the rooms filled with the shadows of unvoiced desires. As we linger in this part of her story, imagining the soft creak of those old hallways and the fading scent of polished wood, we see how deeply these early influences shaped her, how they echoed throughout her rise and reverberated through her fall. And now, as the last shadow retreats down that long corridor of memory, we step quietly into the next part of her journey, where the emotional winter of her youth begins to settle upon her heart, shaping the sorrows and silences that would accompany her into adulthood. The last shadow slips down that long corridor, fading into a stillness that feels almost wintry. And from this gathering quiet, we step into the season of Brenda's life, in which the chill around her heart deepened, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of frost forming along the edges of a forgotten window pane. It was a winter without snow, a winter without storms, a winter composed not of weather but of feeling, the kind of internal cold that settles gently yet persistently until it becomes indistinguishable from the air one breathes. And so, we enter this part of her story with the tenderness such winters require. For the landscape of her young adulthood was shaped not only by the glamour surrounding her, but by the quiet ache that grew steadily beneath it, the ache of someone who could not find warmth in the places where warmth was promised. She was still so young when she first began to feel the unmistakable weight of emotional isolation. To observers, she seemed poised, delicate, calm, but beneath the smooth surface lay a stillness born not of composure, but of loneliness. Her family's tensions, her fractured upbringing, and the relentless expectations placed upon her had woven a subtle chill into her early years, and that chill accompanied her into adolescence like an invisible companion, always near, always present. She would enter a room filled with admirers and feel a sudden distancing, as though the world around her had shifted a few inches away. She could be surrounded by laughter, conversation, and celebration, yet feel the familiar cold forming quietly inside, reminding her that attention was not the same as affection, that admiration was not the same as understanding. It is common, perhaps, for young people to experience moments of doubt, moments when the world feels uncertain. But for Brenda, these moments were constant companions, their presence intensified by the particular circumstances of her life. The winter settling within her was not born of a single event, but of the accumulation of countless small ones. The softness absent from her father's voice, the critique hidden in her mother's compliments, the polite distance in the eyes of those who praised her beauty, the pressure to remain serene even when her heart trembled. She began to equate silence with safety, believing that speaking her fears or desires might disrupt the fragile structures around her. And so, she folded her emotions inward, storing them in quiet corners of her mind where they remained untouched yet unforgotten, growing colder with time. This emotional winter was further deepened by her growing awareness of the world's expectations of her. The attention she received, though flattering to those around her, felt increasingly hollow to her. She had become an object of fascination rather than a person of substance. Her beauty, rather than a simple part of her identity, had become the axis upon which others rotated. And as the fascination with her grew, so too did her sense of detachment. She could feel the invisible eyes upon her, even in moments of solitude, a sensation that brought with it both anxiety and a strange numbness. The more she was seen, the less she felt known. The more she was admired, the more she felt alone. In this winter of the heart, Brenda's internal world became her refuge, but also her burden. She dreamed of warmth, of connection, of a life shaped by authenticity rather than performance. She longed for moments of intimacy, small gestures, whispered confidences, the kind of closeness that makes one feel at home in the world. Yet each time she moved towards such closeness, she found it slipping away, obscured by the image others expected her to uphold. Even friendships, which might have offered companionship, were often complicated by the constraints of social expectation. Some saw her as an icon rather than an equal. Others approached her with curiosity rather than compassion, and still others found themselves unable to penetrate the quiet reserve she maintained as a shield against disappointment. It is possible that Brenda herself did not fully understand the depth of the winter settling within her. She may have interpreted it as shyness, as sensitivity, as a simple desire for privacy. But those who observed her more closely might have sensed the subtle signs, the moments when her gaze drifted into distance, the way she sometimes hesitated before joining conversations, the slight stiffness in her shoulders as though bracing against an unseen wind. These gestures spoke of an internal climate colder than her surroundings suggested, a climate shaped by absence, expectation, and the quiet erosion of hope. As she stepped into young adulthood, the winter deepened further, intensified by the pressures that accompanied her growing fame. The scrutiny she faced, the relentless commentary on her appearance, the constant comparisons to other young women, these forces did not merely chill her spirit. They began to freeze parts of it. Her sense of self became increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent on the approval of others. She grew fearful of disappointing those who believed in her image, and fear, when mingled with loneliness, becomes a cold so penetrating that warmth feels almost unreachable. Her eating disorder, which had begun subtly in adolescence, grew more severe during this time. It was both a symptom and a cause of her emotional winter. In attempting to control her body, she was attempting to control the chaos inside her. In diminishing herself physically, she mirrored the diminishing sense of self she felt internally. Yet to the outside world, her frailty appeared delicate, refined, even enviable. They saw the beauty of pale fragility, not the suffering concealed within it. And so, the world unknowingly encouraged the very behaviors that deepened her despair, reinforcing the winter she longed to escape. Romantic relationships offered brief pockets of warmth, but these were fleeting, often complicated by the same forces that shaped the rest of her life. Some men were drawn to her image rather than her essence. Others felt overwhelmed by her vulnerability, and still others sought from her a perfection she could not, and should not have been expected to, maintain. Each failed connection left her colder, more wary, more convinced that true warmth was something destined to slip from her grasp. Through all of this, there were moments when Brenda glimpsed the possibility of spring, moments when kindness touched her life unexpectedly, when someone listened without judgment, when she felt briefly unburdened by expectation. These moments, though rare, sustained her in ways she may not have realized. They hinted at a world where she might have found belonging had circumstances been different. But like early thaws that melt only the surface of a frozen landscape, they offered only temporary relief. And now, as we linger in this contemplation of her emotional winter, we imagine her sitting quietly near a frost-covered window, the light outside pale and distant, her breath fogging the glass as she traces patterns in the condensation with a gentleness that hints at the tenderness she carried within. The snow outside is not real, yet the cold is, and it gathers around her like a soft, mournful cloak. With this image, delicate and unresolved, we follow her into the next chapter of her life, where the divide between her public and private worlds deepens further, shaping the dual existence she struggled to reconcile. The frost on that imagined window pane begins to blur, softening at the edges as though warmed by a distant fading glow. And from this delicate shift, we enter the realm where Brenda's life split cleanly into two distinct worlds, the public and the private, forever intertwined yet fundamentally opposed. It is here, in this quiet tension between what she showed and what she felt, that the essence of her struggle becomes most visible. For every human life contains two stories, the one told aloud, shaped by outward gestures and social expectations, and the one whispered only in solitude, carried like a secret beneath the surface of daily existence. Brenda's public story was luminous, polished, and endlessly admired, while her private story grew dimmer with time, marked by doubts, griefs, and silent wounds. The contrast between these two realities formed a delicate fault line within her, one that widened as she tried to satisfy both worlds without losing herself entirely, an impossible task that slowly eroded her spirit. To those who followed her life from afar, Brenda was the perpetual icon of grace, the quiet beauty who embodied elegance with such apparent ease that she seemed almost beyond earthly struggles. Newspapers carried her image with reverence, detailing her appearances at luncheons, dances, and charity events as though each one were a chapter in a glamorous epic. Socialites spoke of her with admiration tinged by envy, praising her pale refinement, her self-control, her delicate composure. Even strangers who never met her felt they knew her, constructing in their minds a version of Brenda that aligned with the ideal they wished to believe in. She became, in the eyes of the world, a kind of living ornament. Silent, perfect, admired from a distance, valuable for the way she enhanced the social landscape of her time. But such admiration, offered without true understanding, carries a price, for it expects the admired person to remain frozen in the role assigned to them. The public adored Brenda as long as she fulfilled the image they cherished, but they did not consider what that image cost her. Her private life, however, was shaped by vulnerabilities too nuanced to be captured in photographs or described in articles. Behind the serene expressions that graced magazine covers lay a heart burdened by loneliness, insecurity, and the remnants of childhood wounds that had never been allowed to heal. Her inner world was rich with longing for authenticity, for acceptance, for the freedom to exist without the constant pressure of scrutiny. Yet each time she attempted to reveal some part of her true self, she encountered the invisible barrier created by others' expectations. Those around her, conditioned by society's fascination with her image, often failed to see beyond the surface. They conversed with the version of her they perceived, not the person she truly was. This disconnect deepened her isolation, for she could not reconcile the adoration she received with the emptiness she felt. In public, she performed the role of the graceful debutante with practiced ease. She moved slowly, gracefully, as though gliding across the polished floors of ballrooms that were both familiar and foreign to her. She learned to answer questions with careful restraint, to pose for photographs in ways that accentuated her delicate features, to maintain a calm composure even when her mind churned with anxiety. This performance became second nature, a kind of mask she wore automatically whenever she stepped into the public eye. But masks, even the loveliest ones, grow heavy with time. Behind hers, Brenda felt the weight of maintaining a perfection she had never chosen for herself, and the strain of this tension seeped into her private moments like winter wind beneath an unsealed door. Her private world, by contrast, was marked by quiet rituals of withdrawal. She often retreated into solitude, seeking refuge in the stillness of her room, where the expectations of others could not reach her. Yet even in these moments of retreat, she carried the imprint of her public persona, unable to fully shed the image she believed she needed to uphold. She would sit before her mirror, not in vanity, but in uncertainty, studying the reflection that seemed both familiar and foreign. She wondered whether the world saw her true self or only the silhouette shaped by their admiration. She questioned whether anyone would care for the parts of her that remained hidden, the parts that yearned for affection, that trembled with insecurity, that feared the passing of time and the eventual fading of the beauty that had become her identity. These questions, echoing through her private moments, deepened the chasm between her inner truth and her outer performance. As her public fame grew, so too did her internal fractures. The strain of maintaining her image exacerbated her struggles with eating, turning what began as a coping mechanism into a destructive cycle that consumed much of her energy and further isolated her from others. In public, her frailty was admired as a symbol of refinement, but in private, it left her feeling fragile, faint, and increasingly disconnected from her physical self. The compliments she received for her appearance, intended as praise, often felt like chains, reminding her that the world valued her most when she was fading. This paradox, being prized for the very signs of her suffering, deepened the sorrow that had taken root within her. Her relationships suffered as a result. Friends often misinterpreted her quietness as aloofness, unaware that she withdrew out of fear rather than indifference. Romantic partners, drawn initially to her beauty, sometimes found themselves unprepared for the depth of her emotional needs or overwhelmed by the fragile softness she rarely permitted herself to show. And when these relationships faltered, as many did, Brenda internalized the pain, believing that she had failed in some essential way. Each disappointment reinforced her belief that she was somehow unworthy of lasting affection, that she was destined to be admired but never understood, adored but never truly held. This belief, tender and tragic, settled into her private world like a constant companion, reminding her of the distance between the life she lived and the life she longed for. Her private struggles grew increasingly painful in contrast to her public image, creating a kind of emotional double life that few could navigate without falling into despair. She oscillated between these two realities with a quiet desperation, hoping to find a space where they might meet, where she could exist as a whole person rather than a fractured one. But the more she tried to reconcile them, the more they seemed to repel one another, as though bound by opposing forces. And so she carried on, existing in the delicate space between visibility and invisibility, between admiration and loneliness, between performance and truth. The deeper tragedy of this dual existence lies not only in the suffering it caused her, but in how invisible that suffering remained to those who watched her so closely. The public saw only the poised debutante, the symbol of elegance, the face of a bygone era's ideal. They did not see the whispers of her private despair, the quiet tremble of her hands, the moments when she sat alone trying to understand why the warmth she craved always seemed to slip beyond reach. And perhaps, in some sense, she grew accustomed to this invisibility, accepting it as an inevitable part of her life, even as it wore down her spirit. As we linger in this contemplation, we imagine her sitting in a softly lit room, her public mask removed, her private emotions settling around her like a fragile veil. The sounds of distant laughter drift through the quiet, mingling with her thoughts in a way that blurs the boundary between the world she shows and the world she hides. And in this delicate, unresolved stillness, we follow her into the next chapter, where the quiet battles she fought in private deepen into struggles that shaped the sorrowful contours of her later years. The soft veil of Brenda's private world settles with a delicate, melancholy grace as we step into the next quiet chamber of her life, where the battles she carried within her, silent, persistent, and profoundly human, begin to reveal themselves with greater clarity. These were not battles waged in the open, nor were they recognized by the admiring crowds who followed her public image with fascination. Instead, they were the subtle struggles that unfolded in the privacy of her mind, in the stillness of moments no one witnessed, in the gentle tremors that marked her deepest vulnerabilities. To understand Brenda fully, one must walk carefully into this realm of quiet conflict, where sorrow hid behind serenity, where hope flickered like a candle, struggling against an unseen draft, and where the essence of her humanity, tender, complicated, and fragile, was most visible. The roots of these struggles stretched back to her childhood, as winters of emotional detachment and fractured belonging planted seeds of uncertainty that grew with her. Yet it was during her adolescence and early adulthood, under the intense glare of public scrutiny, that these internal battles intensified into something more consuming. Among them, her battle with disordered eating was perhaps the most insidious, weaving itself into her daily life with a deceptive subtlety. What began as an attempt to exert control over a world that felt overwhelming gradually became a pattern of self-denial, a quiet act of erasure driven by the belief that she needed to diminish herself to be worthy of admiration. The flatter her stomach became, the emptier her heart felt, as though each denied meal fed her self-doubt more than her body. The world, blinded by its fascination with delicate beauty, mistook her fragility for refinement, reinforcing the very habits that were slowly consuming her. This struggle, however, was only one of many. Brenda wrestled with profound loneliness, an ache that deepened in direct proportion to her public exposure. The more people admired her, the more distant she felt from them, sensing that the qualities they praised were not the ones that reflected her true self, but the ones she had been taught to present. Her conversations often unfolded like rehearsed performances, filled with polite responses and measured elegance. She seldom revealed her fears, her doubts, or her longing for affection, fearing that vulnerability might fracture the image others held of her. This self-protection created a paradox. The more she hid her true self, the more isolated she felt, and the more isolated she felt, the harder it became to reveal any part of her inner world. Loneliness settled over her like a fine, cold mist, difficult to see, yet impossible to escape. Compounding this was her lifelong sense of inadequacy, a quiet but constant undertow that pulled at her with each passing year. She feared she was not enough, not beautiful enough, not charming enough, not poised enough to satisfy the expectations others placed upon her. These fears were not rooted in vanity but in insecurity, shaped by the emotional inconsistencies of her childhood and the pressure of living beneath an unrelenting societal gaze. Each compliment she received felt strangely hollow, for it praised the image she presented rather than the person she wished to be. And so even admiration became a source of discomfort, reminding her of the gulf between who she was and who she was expected to remain. Her romantic relationships, too, became entangled in these internal battles. She entered them with hope, but often found herself overwhelmed by the fear of being truly seen. Men were drawn to her beauty, her quiet charm, her mystique, yet few recognized the emotional fragility beneath her composed exterior. Those who did sometimes found themselves unsure of how to offer her the stability she needed, for her vulnerabilities required a depth of understanding not easily found in the society circles she inhabited. When relationships faltered, as they often did, Brenda internalized the disappointment as personal failure, adding another layer to the quiet ache she carried. She yearned for closeness, yet closeness often felt dangerous, capable of exposing the parts of her she least wished to reveal. It was a cycle she longed to escape, but could not break, for it was rooted not in circumstance, but in the deepest chambers of her heart. Depression began to settle into her life during these years, though it was seldom named as such. In her era, emotional struggles were whispered about behind closed doors, dismissed as melancholy, exhaustion, or oversensitivity. And so Brenda bore her sadness in silence, masking it beneath practiced grace. There were days when she felt disconnected from the world around her, as though observing life from behind a pane of glass. There were evenings when the laughter of others drifted around her like a distant breeze, failing to warm her no matter how closely she stood beside it. There were nights when she lay awake, staring into the darkness, searching for a sense of purpose she could not grasp. She longed for someone to notice these quiet cries for help, but her sadness, like her beauty, was delicate, understated, and easily overlooked by a world that preferred polished surfaces to poignant truths. Perhaps one of her deepest struggles was her sense of identity, or rather, the profound uncertainty she felt about it. Who was she, apart from the image others had crafted for her? What dreams belonged to her alone? What desires had she abandoned in order to fulfill the expectations projected onto her? These questions drifted through her mind like soft, persistent echoes, but answers eluded her, obscured by years spent performing perfection. Identity, once lost or blurred, is difficult to reclaim, and Brenda found herself wandering through her own life as though searching for a door she could not find. She tried at various points to shape a life for herself beyond the world of debutantes and social obligations, but each attempt was undermined by the residual belief that the world valued her only for the image she had once embodied. Even as she struggled, there were moments of quiet strength within her, moments when she allowed herself to imagine a different path, a different life, a different self. These moments were fragile but real, revealing a resilience often overshadowed by her more visible vulnerabilities. She had a capacity for reflection, for tenderness, for dreaming, yet these qualities found few places to root in the world she inhabited. Still, they flickered within her, small flames refusing to extinguish despite the chill surrounding them. As we linger in this exploration of Brenda's quiet battles, one might imagine her sitting beside a dim lamp, her hands folded gently in her lap, her gaze drifting toward a window where the night presses softly against the glass. The room around her is silent, but not empty. It carries the weight of unspoken emotions, the traces of hopes deferred, the gentle hum of a heart still seeking warmth. Outside, the world continues with its familiar rhythms, unaware of the private sorrow within. Inside, Brenda sits with her thoughts, her memories, her longings, alone yet accompanied by the invisible threads of the past that shaped her. And from this stillness, this delicate intersection of pain and resilience, we move into the next chapter of her story, where the burden of beauty, the very quality that defined her in the public's eyes, reveals itself as both blessing and curse, illuminating the complex relationship she carried with the image that made her famous. The quiet hum of those unseen struggles lingers like a breath against frosted glass, and as it slowly dissolves, we step gently into another chamber of Brenda's story, one illuminated by a light both beautiful and burdened. It is here, in this tender, complicated space, that the weight of beauty itself becomes the central figure. Beauty that once defined her, celebrated her, lifted her into the public gaze, and yet quietly shaped the sorrow that followed her through every season of her life. To understand Brenda without understanding the peculiar gravity of her beauty would be to look only at shadows rather than the full shape of her existence. For beauty was not merely an attribute she possessed. It became the axis around which her entire world revolved, often without her choosing, often without her knowing the full cost of its power. From her earliest years, Brenda was told she was beautiful, not in the casual way children are sometimes complimented, but with the lingering public fascination reserved for rare, delicate things. Adults observed her with the intensity of connoisseurs, assessing fine porcelain, critics with opinions disguised as praise. Her pale complexion, emerging grace, and fragile features were treated not as qualities she inhabited, but as assets she carried, as though her physical appearance were a kind of inheritance she must preserve with the utmost care. Beauty, for many, is a source of delight. For Brenda, it was a responsibility, one she felt before she understood its implications, one that followed her even in sleep. And with such responsibility came a subtle pressure, the expectation that she must never falter, never change, never deviate from the delicate ideal others had constructed around her. It was as though she were expected to remain frozen in time, suspended in a moment of youthful perfection, untouched by growth, sorrow, or the natural evolution of self. As she entered adolescence, this pressure intensified. Her mother, eager to secure her daughter's place among society's elite, monitored her appearance with a meticulous eye, offering advice, correction, and sometimes critique that seeped into Brenda's heart and formed the quiet beginnings of her insecurities. The world outside their home echoed these messages, praising her for the very qualities that made her feel most vulnerable. At school, at social gatherings, at events where she was introduced to other prominent families, she felt the eyes upon her, eyes measuring, admiring, judging. For some young women, such attention might have been intoxicating, but for Brenda, it brought a growing fear. The fear of disappointing those who believed her beauty was her greatest value. The fear of losing admiration should she change or falter. The fear that her identity was tied irrevocably to the image others adored. This fear, subtle at first, deepened into something far more consuming as Brenda stepped into the full brightness of the public eye. When the press declared her the Debutante of the Year, her image circulated across the nation, capturing the imagination of readers who wanted a symbol of elegance during a time when the world felt unsteady. The photographs of her, the delicate curve of her neck, the serene expression in her eyes, the grace with which she carried herself, became so iconic that they began to overshadow the life she lived beyond them. Beauty, which had once been merely part of her, now became all the world saw. And as the image of her beauty spread, so too did the burden it placed upon her. Every comment, every photograph, every article reinforced the belief that she must embody perfection, that her physical appearance was a kind of promise she owed to the world. In private, this burden became a source of profound anxiety. She scrutinized herself in mirrors not out of vanity, but out of fear. Fear that her reflection would betray her. Fear that her features no longer aligned with the public's expectations. Fear that time, illness, or emotion might alter the image she felt obligated to maintain. This fear contributed to the deepening of her disordered eating as she sought to control her body with increasing strictness, believing that thinness equated to approval and that any deviation from the fragile ideal could result in disdain or disappointment. The compliments she received, phrases like "so delicate," "so slender," "so perfect," were intended as praise, yet to Brenda they became chains, reminders that people valued her most when she was most diminished, both physically and emotionally. Yet beauty, while burdensome, also offered her fleeting moments of power, moments when she saw how others responded to it, when she recognized that her image captivated rooms, opened doors, and drew attention in ways few could ignore. These moments were not rooted in arrogance, but in the strange relationship she had with her reflection, a relationship that oscillated between empowerment and entrapment. She understood, in a quiet, intuitive way, that beauty shaped the world's response to her, even as she questioned whether it shaped her response to herself. Was she truly seen or merely admired? Was she loved or simply desired? Did people care for her heart or only the appearance she wore like an ornate gown? As she aged, the burden of beauty grew even more complex. The passage of time, which comes gently to all beings, felt to Brenda like an approaching storm. She feared the fading of the qualities that had once made her celebrated, fearing that without them she might disappear entirely in the eyes of those who had defined her by her appearance. Each small change, a new line, a shift in expression, the slightest alteration in her figure, felt like a threat to the fragile identity she had never fully chosen. The public, too, played its part in this fear. Society praises beauty with one breath and critiques its fading with the next, and Brenda, who understood this pattern all too well, found herself desperately clinging to the image that had once been her currency. But beauty, in its purest form, is not a fixed state. It is fluid, evolving, shaped by experience, softened by sorrow, deepened by wisdom. Brenda, however, was never allowed the freedom to evolve. She was imprisoned by the expectation that she remain eternally youthful, eternally delicate, eternally untouched by the complexities that shape real human lives. This expectation became one of the deepest wounds she carried, for it denied her the simple right to grow older, to grow stronger, to grow more authentically into herself. As we linger in this contemplation, imagining her seated before a mirror in a dim, quiet room, the light catching her features in a way that blurs the boundary between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming, we see the truth that eluded so many during her life. Her beauty, celebrated by the world, was never the source of her sorrow. The sorrow came from the weight placed upon it, the isolation born from it, the expectations tethered to it. And in this tender recognition, we prepare to follow her into the next chamber of her story, where her longing for love, for connection, for belonging, for the warmth of another heart, becomes the central thread of her quiet yearning. The soft, tremulous glow of that dim room lingers as we step deeper into Brenda's story, and from this quiet light emerges the tender truth of her longing. A longing not for fame, nor for admiration, nor even for the comfort of certainty, but for something far more delicate and essential, the ache for love, for approval, for connection that might warm the places within her life left cold by expectation and silence. It is within this yearning, woven like a thin silver thread through every chapter of her existence, that we find the tangled heart of her journey, where hope and sorrow intertwined in ways she could neither untangle nor escape. For beneath the polished veneer that dazzled the world lay a soul hungry for gentleness, one that reached again and again for affection, only to find that the hands extended toward her were often guided not by tenderness, but by desire, not by understanding, but by fascination, not by empathy, but by the allure of her fading spotlight. From a young age, Brenda learned that approval came in particular forms: praise for her beauty, recognition of her poise, polite admiration from those who expected her to fulfill a role that had been written long before she entered the stage. But such approval, though plentiful, lacked the warmth she sought. It was conditional, ornamental, offered with the same detachment one might give a lovely painting. What she yearned for was something far deeper, the sense that her heart mattered more than her appearance, that her feelings carried weight, that her presence brought comfort not because it pleased the eye, but because it reflected a connection that ran soul to soul. Yet in her world, shaped so profoundly by appearances, affection often arrived tangled in the very expectations that burdened her most. Her first experiences with romantic interest revealed this pattern with painful clarity. Young men drawn to her beauty saw her as the ideal debutante, imagining her as a prize to be admired, a jewel to display, a companion who would elevate their own social standing. They praised her grace and delicacy, but rarely sought to know the girl behind the gentle smile. Conversations drifted toward her appearance, her events, her future prospects, rarely toward her inner world, her fears, her dreams, her quiet questions about identity. And when she attempted to reveal parts of her true self, she found her vulnerability met with confusion or disinterest, as though her depth contradicted the image others preferred to preserve. These early disappointments settled into her heart like soft snow, cold yet quiet, shaping her belief that love might not be something she was permitted to experience fully. Her yearning for approval from her parents further complicated her search for affection. Her mother's love, though present, was threaded with criticism and an unspoken demand for perfection, leaving Brenda uncertain of her worth when she faltered. Her father's affection, muted by emotional reserve, created a longing for tenderness she seldom received. These gaps in her early life became tender wounds that made her particularly susceptible to seeking validation from others, hoping they might offer the unconditional acceptance she had missed. Yet those who approached her often brought with them expectations no less heavy than those of her family. She found herself caught in a cycle of giving more of herself than she received, believing that love might emerge if she simply tried harder, smiled more beautifully, pleased more thoroughly, diminished her needs more quietly. As she moved into the height of her public life, romantic connections became even more fraught. The allure of her fame attracted admirers who were captivated by the image rather than the woman. Some pursued her for the prestige her companionship offered, others for the validation of possessing the attention of a national beauty, and still others simply out of curiosity. Brenda, sensitive and hopeful, often mistook their interest for affection, only to discover that their admiration faded as quickly as it arrived, leaving her feeling abandoned, confused, and ashamed for having hoped too openly. These disappointments intensified her insecurity, convincing her that perhaps love was something others could receive easily, but which she would forever approach from a distance. There were, of course, moments when she glimpsed the possibility of genuine connection, Moments when a kind word lingered longer than usual, when a gaze held warmth rather than appraisal, when a conversation touched upon something deeper than social ritual. In these rare instances, she felt a spark of hope, imagining a future where she might find someone who accepted her fragility rather than recoiling from it. But such moments were fleeting, often extinguished by the complexities of her emotional world or by the pressures of the public gaze that made intimacy feel unsafe. Even when affection was offered sincerely, Brenda struggled to receive it fully, hesitant to trust it, afraid that any display of need would push people away. Her relationships were further strained by the shadow of her internal battles. Her eating disorder, her bouts of depression, her deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, all these created a delicate fragility that required understanding, patience, and emotional steadiness from a partner. Yet few possessed the maturity or insight to navigate these tender spaces with care. Some withdrew out of discomfort, others attempted to fix what they did not comprehend, and still others saw her vulnerability as an inconvenience rather than an invitation to understand her more deeply. Each such experience added another thread to the tangled fabric of her relationships, making her long for closeness even as she feared it. In the quiet moments between the endings of these connections, Brenda often retreated into contemplation, reflecting on what love might feel like if it were given without expectation. She wondered what it would mean to be cherished, not for her beauty or grace, but for the softness of her heart, the gentleness of her spirit, the quiet yearning she carried. She imagined sitting beside someone who saw through the layers of her public image, who recognized the sorrow that lived in her eyes and did not turn away, who offered warmth not as reward, but as comfort. Yet such visions, though cherished, felt impossibly distant in the world she inhabited. This longing shaped not only her relationships, but her entire trajectory through life. It influenced her decisions, her responses, her sense of identity. Every disappointment deepened her belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, or at least unlovable in the ways that mattered most. And this belief, tender and tragic, became one of the defining threads in her story, guiding her toward choices that offered fleeting acceptance but deepened her isolation. Despite her heartbreak, Brenda never fully relinquished her hope for connection. Even in her later years, long after the world had turned its attention elsewhere, she carried within her a faint ember of longing, a quiet wish that perhaps love might still find her in some gentle, unexpected way. It is this ember, this refusal to extinguish hope entirely, that speaks to the quiet resilience within her, a resilience overshadowed by her more visible struggles but no less real. And now, as we linger in this delicate part of her life, imagining her sitting alone in a dim room, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of a teacup as she contemplates the tender ache of her longing, we follow her into the next chapter, where the echoes of her most celebrated night return, revealing the ballroom not as a place of triumph, but as a haunting symbol that echoed through her life, long after the music faded. The fragile ache of her longing lingers like the fading warmth of a candle just extinguished, and as we move forward, the air seems to shift, carrying us back, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to the echoing chamber that had shaped so much of her destiny. In this chapter of her story, we return to the ballroom, not as it was on the night of her triumph, radiant and thunderous with applause, but as it lived within her memory afterward, transformed into something far more haunting, reflective, and symbolic. For the ballroom, with its shimmering chandeliers and polished floors, stood at the very center of her public life. And long after the music stopped, its echo followed her like a ghost, whispering of a moment she had never fully owned yet, could never fully escape. It became a kind of eternal hall in the architecture of her mind, a place where triumph and sorrow intertwined so seamlessly that she could no longer distinguish one from the other. On the night of her debut, the ballroom had been a spectacle of grandeur. Hundreds of guests arrived in glittering gowns and sharp suits, eager to witness the presentation of the young woman who had already captured the nation's imagination. Press photographers swarmed like restless moths around flames of chandeliers, their flashbulbs bursting in quick, dazzling rhythms that felt almost like applause made of light. The air was thick with perfume, champagne, laughter, the sensory hum of a night designed to dazzle. And Brenda, dressed in a gown that shimmered with the pale glow of winter moonlight, descended the staircase with a grace so refined it seemed almost unreal. That image, her slight frame framed by opulence, her composed features illuminated by crystal light, became the defining symbol of her life. It was printed in newspapers, admired by strangers, whispered about across the country as though it embodied some mythic ideal. But within Brenda's mind, the ballroom took on a different shape in the years that followed. It became not a place of celebration, but a vast, echoing cathedral of expectation. Each time she remembered it, she felt again the weight of the eyes upon her, the silent demand that she embody perfection, the awareness that the world was watching, not her, but the version of her they wished to see. The applause that had filled the room felt in memory like a tide pulling her away from herself, sweeping her into a life scripted by others. The staircase she descended that night became, in reflection, the threshold between the childhood she had barely experienced and the adulthood she had not yet learned to navigate. And the gown that shimmered so beautifully under the lights became, over time, a symbol of how she had been adorned, displayed, and admired without ever being fully understood. The ballroom itself, though physical in reality, became metaphorical in her recollection. She thought of its vastness, its glitter, its noise, its relentless brightness. She remembered standing in the center of it all, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Her inner voice drowned by orchestral music and polite conversation. She recalled the brief moments when she felt herself drifting away, her mind pulling back from the spectacle as though seeking refuge from the intensity of it. She remembered how her smile felt fixed, how her heartbeat quickened each time someone approached her, how her hands trembled slightly when no one was looking. These sensations, buried beneath the facade of composure, deepened with time, transforming the ballroom from a luminous memory into a quiet inner echo chamber where her insecurities reverberated long after the lights dimmed. There were nights in her later years when she lay awake, replaying the scene in her mind, each detail shifting slightly with each recollection. She wondered what might have happened had that night been simpler, less extravagant, less monumental. She wondered whether her life would have followed a different path had she been allowed to enter adulthood gently, rather than being thrust into it beneath the nation's gaze. She wondered whether the applause that had once surrounded her had prevented her from hearing the softer truths within herself, the truths about what she wanted, who she was, and how she wished her life to unfold. Sometimes, in these quiet nights, the ballroom came to her as a place of loss, not of celebration. She saw not the admiring guests, but the empty space beneath the chandeliers after they had left, when the music had ceased and the echoes of footsteps faded. In that imagined emptiness, she felt the full weight of solitude she had carried, even on the night of her triumph. At other times, the ballroom appeared to her as a place filled with ghosts, ghosts of moments she had lived, ghosts of expectations she had never met, ghosts of the person she had been expected to become but could not sustain. The ghosts drifted across the polished floor in her imagination, whispering softly, reminding her of the moment when her life became something she no longer controlled. There were also gentler memories among these recollections, fragments of warmth that flickered like candlelight. She remembered the feel of her gown brushing softly against her skin, the faint scent of gardenias pinned in her hair, the quiet pride in her father's eyes as he stood beside her, awkward yet sincere in his affection. She remembered the way the music curled through the air, lifting her momentarily out of her anxiety and into a dance that felt almost effortless. She remembered the hush that fell over the crowd when she entered the room, a hush not of pressure but of wonder. These memories, though overshadowed by the sorrowful ones, offered her small glimpses of what the night might have meant had her life unfolded differently. They reminded her that even within the weight of expectation, there had been moments of genuine light. But more often, the ballroom lingered within her as a symbol of everything she could not escape. It represented the moment when her identity became public property, when the world decided who she was before she had the chance to discover it herself. It represented the point at which her image overtook her essence, when admiration overshadowed intimacy, when applause drowned out her quiet pleas for authenticity. And in this way, the ballroom became a recurring presence in her inner life, a place where hope, fear, and longing intertwined in a way she could neither unravel nor forget. As we linger in this reflection, imagining her standing once more beneath the chandeliers, not the young girl admired by the world, but the older woman recalling the moment with both wistful tenderness and aching sorrow, we sense the lingering resonance of that night. We sense how the ballroom, once filled with revelry, became in later years a soft, haunting echo of the life she lived and the life she lost. And so, carried by the fading music of that distant night, we move gently into the next part of her story, where forgotten rooms and overlooked chapters begin to emerge, revealing the parts of Brenda's life seldom captured by photographs or remembered by history. Parts that offer a fuller, more human glimpse of the woman behind the image. The last trembling notes of that distant waltz fade into a silence so soft it feels almost fragile. And from within that quiet, we begin to sense the presence of rooms long overlooked. Rooms that belong to Brenda, not through celebration or spectacle, but through the quieter, more intimate corners of her life that the world seldom noticed. These forgotten rooms are not literal spaces alone, though some were indeed places where she sought refuge. They are also the metaphorical chambers of her experience, those moments and efforts that lay outside the bright glare of the ballroom, beyond the reach of press photographers, untouched by public fascination. They include her small acts of resilience, her attempts at reinvention, her quieter contributions, and the subtler truths of her character, truths often overshadowed by the dramatic arc history preferred to remember. In exploring these rooms, we uncover the parts of her story that breathe with the tenderness of a life lived in shadows, a life richer and more complex than the single image of a debutante descending a staircase. One such room was the space she created for herself through writing. Though never widely published or celebrated, Brenda kept journals and wrote occasional reflections in letters, fragments of her inner world where she allowed honesty to take shape without fear of judgment. Within these writings, she captured moments of introspection that revealed a depth many never suspected. She wrote about her longing for peace, her desire to understand herself apart from the image imposed upon her, and the gentle ache she felt when observing the world from the margins. Her words carried both sorrow and beauty, expressing a sensitivity that might have blossomed into something extraordinary had circumstances been kinder. These private writings were, in their own way, her rebellion against the narrow life she had been given. They offered her a voice in a world that had so often spoken for her. Another forgotten room in her story lies in her attempts to forge a life beyond society's scrutiny. After the peak of her fame, she sought to involve herself in small philanthropic activities, not the grand society functions the press enjoyed publicizing, but modest acts of kindness that emerged from her longing to feel useful and connected. She visited charitable institutions, engaged quietly in volunteer work, and offered support to causes that resonated with her own experiences of struggle. These gestures were seldom acknowledged publicly, for they lacked the glamour that once defined her image, yet they reflected a sincerity of heart that had always lived within her, waiting for a chance to be acknowledged. There were also relationships, friendships, and connections that, though often fragile, offered her glimpses of belonging. Among these were individuals who saw through her pale elegance to the gentle, thoughtful person beneath. They shared conversations that had nothing to do with social expectations or public image. They spoke with her not as an icon, but as a companion. These friendships, though sometimes fleeting or complicated by her insecurities, provided moments of genuine warmth. They are rarely mentioned in accounts of her life, for history tends to favor dramatic romances or public scandals. Yet these simple connections may have offered her more solace than any grand affair ever could. They belong to the forgotten rooms of her story because they were small, unadorned, and deeply human. Equally overlooked were her periods of quiet ambition. Times when she considered various paths she might follow, roles she might occupy, lives she might attempt to build. She explored the idea of acting, drawn perhaps to the possibility of becoming someone other than the version of herself the world had created. She considered working within fashion, captivated by the artistry behind the garments that had once adorned her. She even entertained the idea of writing more seriously. But each path was shadowed by the doubts instilled during her youth, by the steady erosion of confidence caused by public scrutiny, and by the weight of her ongoing struggles with health and depression. Still, the fact that she attempted such pursuits, however tentatively, speaks to a resilience overshadowed by her more visible fragility. These attempts were small lanterns of hope held against the vast darkness of expectation, a reminder that she sought, however quietly, to define herself on her own terms. Among the most tender of these forgotten rooms was the realm of her solitude, a space she inhabited not with bitterness but with a kind of contemplative gentleness. She found solace in small rituals, arranging flowers in a vase, sifting through old photographs, listening to soft music late into the night, or watching the shifting light of afternoon pass across a windowsill. These moments, insignificant to the world at large, held profound meaning for her. They offered a respite from the loudness of her public past, a place where she could simply exist without performing, without pleasing, without fear of failing to meet expectations that no longer held power over her. In these quiet rituals, she discovered the faint traces of a self she had always longed to embrace. Her later struggles with health, though tragic, also contained moments of unexpected strength. She confronted her illnesses with a dignity seldom discussed, navigating treatments, setbacks, and disappointments with a perseverance that belied the public's image of her as fragile or passive. She sought help when she felt overwhelmed, attempted therapies when hope flickered faintly, and endured long stretches of emotional winter with a kind of silent courage that deserves remembrance. These acts of quiet bravery, daily, uncelebrated, invisible to the world, reveal a dimension of her story far more profound than the mythology of her beauty. They show a woman who continued, despite despair, to search for healing, for meaning, for a place in the world where she might finally feel at home. And then there were the small joys she carried, often unnoticed by those around her. Her appreciation for simple kindness, her sensitivity to music, her affection for animals, her soft laughter that emerged only in moments of genuine comfort. These elements of her personality, overshadowed by the image history preserved, belong to the forgotten rooms of her story. They remind us that she was not simply a symbol, a statistic, or a cautionary tale, but a person marked by nuance, by tenderness, by moments of brightness that flickered even in her darkest years. As we linger in these quiet chambers, imagining her walking slowly through them, touching the edges of memory, pausing at fragments of joy or sorrow that the world never bothered to ask about, we begin to understand the fullness of her humanity. She was not only the girl celebrated in headlines, nor only the woman overshadowed by personal struggle. She was both and more. She lived in the spaces between those extremes, in rooms rarely explored by those who summarized her life with a single photograph. And now, from these forgotten rooms, soft, dim, filled with the gentle weight of things left unseen, we move toward the next part of her story, where the spotlight that once defined her dims at last, and we witness the slow fading of her life into quiet, enduring shadow. The quiet air inside those forgotten rooms settles like a thin layer of dust upon old wooden floors. And as it does, we find ourselves stepping gently into the dusk-like space where the final chapter of Brenda's public life begins to fade. It is here, in the long twilight of her story, that the diminishing glow of the spotlight becomes not a sudden extinguishing, but a slow retreat, like the sun slipping gradually below the horizon, leaving behind a soft and aching afterlight. The world that once watched her so intently began to turn its gaze elsewhere, pulled by new fascinations, new faces, new symbols of youth and glamour. And Brenda, once at the center of this bright orbit, was left standing quietly at its edge, witness to her own vanishing in ways that were both tender and deeply sorrowful. The fading of her fame did not arrive with drama or public spectacle. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as such transitions often do. Newspapers that once featured her with reverence shifted their attention to fresh debutantes, actresses, and heiresses who embodied the evolving tastes of a restless society. Where her name had once appeared in bold type, it now appeared only occasionally in passing mentions or nostalgic retrospectives that cast her more as a relic of a bygone era than as a person still living, breathing, searching. The glamorous season of her youth, so heavily documented and widely admired, became a distant memory in the public consciousness, overshadowed by the rapid cultural changes that marked the mid-century. The world was moving on, and Brenda, still young enough to hope for reinvention, yet already scarred by the burdens of her early fame, felt herself slipping quietly into its margins. For some, such a retreat from the public eye might have offered relief, a chance to begin anew, to shed the expectations that once defined them. But for Brenda, the silence that followed the applause did not bring liberation. Instead, it deepened the loneliness that had accompanied her throughout her life. She had built so much of her identity, unwillingly though it may have been, around the image the world held of her. And when that image faded, when the world ceased to watch, she was left confronting a question she had never been given the chance to answer. Who was she when no one was looking? The uncertainty surrounding this question became a shadow that drifted around her in these later years, growing heavier as she struggled to shape a life that no longer resembled the one she'd been thrust into as a young woman. Her health, already fragile from years of emotional strain and disordered eating, began to decline more noticeably during this period. She experienced long stretches of illness, exhaustion, and physical weakness, each one reinforcing the sense that she was fading not just from the public sphere, but from the world itself. Doctors offered treatments, advice, and cautious concern, but the deeper wounds she carried were beyond the reach of medicine. They lived in the tender spaces of her spirit, in the accumulation of unmet needs and unresolved sorrows that time alone could not mend. She moved through her days with a kind of quiet endurance, aware that her body was weakening, aware that her inner resilience was flagging, yet still holding on to small routines that offered structure in a life increasingly shaped by decline. Financial difficulties added yet another layer of pain to her later years. The fortune and social connections that had once insulated her were long diminished, and she found herself navigating a life far removed from the opulence of her youth. Apartments grew smaller, possessions fewer, opportunities scarce. She made attempts here and there to support herself, small jobs, brief engagements, occasional writing. But her fragile health and waning confidence made stability elusive. There is a quiet tragedy in imagining the woman who once stood beneath glittering chandeliers, now counting the cost of every necessity, her life shrinking, not only in visibility, but in comfort. Yet amidst this fading, there were still moments of gentle humanity. Neighbors who offered kindness without expectation, a few steadfast friends who remained by her side, not because of who she had been, but because they saw the vulnerability and goodness in who she still was. Caregivers who brought warmth into her home through simple acts, setting a cup of tea beside her, adjusting a blanket around her shoulders, listening when she felt strong enough to speak. These small gestures, though never recorded by history, became the quiet threads that held her world together as her strength waned. They reminded her that she was not entirely forgotten, that even a life marked by sorrow could still attract compassion in its softer, quieter moments. But even with these fleeting comforts, Brenda could not escape the sorrow that her life, once so brilliantly illuminated, had dimmed into near obscurity. She often reflected on her past, sometimes with wistfulness, sometimes with regret, often with a quiet resignation that spoke of weariness rather than bitterness. She knew that the world remembered only the image, not the soul, that the shimmering girl in the white gown would always overshadow the woman who lived behind her, that the headlines celebrating her beauty would outlive the far more tender and complicated truth of her humanity. These realizations, though painful, settled into her with a kind of acceptance, as though she had grown accustomed to the distance between who she was and how she was remembered. Her final years unfolded in this quiet, delicate twilight, a time marked not by drama, but by the soft erosion of a life once defined by brilliance. She moved slowly, spoke gently, lived modestly. Her days were shaped by routines, small enough to manage, her world contained to spaces she could navigate. And yet, even as her life contracted, there remained within her a flicker of the introspective spirit that had always lived beneath the surface. She reflected, she remembered, she wrote occasionally, capturing fragments of thought that revealed her yearning to be known, even if only to herself. As we linger in this gentle, sorrowful part of her life, we imagine her sitting by a dim lamp in the quiet of an evening, the room hushed except for the faint ticking of a clock or the rustle of the night outside her window. Her face is older, her frame thinner, her eyes carrying the echoes of both the girl she once was and the woman shaped by years of longing. She is not the sparkling figure the world once adored, but she is no less worthy of remembrance. In this delicate stillness, we sense the soft, inevitable fading of the light that once surrounded her, and as that light retreats, we prepare to follow her into the final realm of her story, the realm of memory, myth, and the misunderstood legacy she left behind. The dim lamplight of her last years flickers once more in the imagination, and as its glow settles into a gentle hush, we drift into the realm where Brenda's story no longer belongs solely to her lived experience, but to the echoes it left behind. Echoes shaped, stretched, and softened by memory, myth, and the quiet failures of understanding that time so often weaves around fragile lives. This is the realm where Brenda Frazier exists, not as the woman she was, but as the figure others believed her to be, a figure built of fragments, public impressions, photographs preserved in brittle albums, anecdotes repeated without reflection, and the kind of soft distortions that creep into stories told across generations. It is here, in these shifting reflections, that her legacy took on a life of its own, drifting further and further from the truth of her longing heart and becoming something both smaller and larger than the woman who lived beneath its shadow. To the world at large, Brenda became a cautionary tale long before her life had reached its quiet end. Writers described her as a symbol of the poor little rich girl, a young woman crushed by the weight of privilege and expectation. Biographers and columnists leaned on easy narratives, her beauty, her debutante fame, her decline, casting her life as a simple arc of rise and fall, as though such a delicate existence could ever be summed up neatly. To some, she was the tragic princess who lost her crown. To others, a figure who embodied the emptiness of high society. And to still others, she was little more than a footnote in the evolving story of American celebrity culture, a faint precursor to the more notorious and troubled public figures who would follow. Yet in each of these versions, the true contours of Brenda's humanity were softened, simplified, or overlooked entirely, replaced by interpretations that suited the storyteller more than they honored the life that inspired them. Part of the misunderstanding of her legacy comes from the era in which she lived. Brenda rose to fame at a time when celebrity was undergoing a quiet transformation. The country, weary from economic hardship and inching toward global conflict, craved symbols of elegance and continuity. Brenda became one such symbol, whether she wished it or not. Her debutante ball captured the national imagination, not because it was unique, but because it arrived at a moment when people sought distraction and spectacle. She personified, for many, the idea of a refined social world untouched by uncertainty. And because her image became synonymous with this ideal, it became easier to critique her later life as evidence of the superficiality of such worlds, rather than as the story of an individual struggling beneath the strain of expectations she never chose. Another reason her legacy became blurred lies in the way her struggles were perceived. Eating disorders, depression, and emotional trauma were not subjects society discussed openly during her lifetime. Instead, they were dismissed, minimized, or hidden behind euphemisms that stripped them of their seriousness. When Brenda withdrew from public life, the narrative favored by newspapers was that she had faded or retreated, as though her disappearance were merely a matter of diminished beauty rather than the result of profound emotional and physical suffering. Her illness became part of the myth, not part of the truth. It was easier to speak of her decline as inevitable, a punishment for vanity, a symbol of the fragility of fame, than to acknowledge the deeper, more painful reality that she had been unprepared and unsupported in a world that expected perfection at every turn. Yet myths can serve a purpose, even when they stray from the truth. They shape the ways in which a person is remembered, and in doing so, they reveal the values of the society that creates them. In Brenda's case, the myth of her life became a mirror reflecting the cultural anxieties of her time. She came to represent the tragedy of a world obsessed with beauty, the consequences of placing unrealistic expectations on young women, the emotional toll of public scrutiny, and the emptiness that can follow when admiration takes the place of understanding. But myths, useful as they may be, rarely allow room for nuance. They compress lives into metaphors, leaving behind the subtler details that might humanize rather than dramatize. For those willing to look deeper, however, a different legacy emerges, one not defined by her public image, but by the quieter truths that speak more directly to the tenderness of her humanity. People who knew her privately recalled her gentleness, her introspective spirit, her capacity for sensitive conversation. They spoke of her kindness in moments unnoticed by the world, of her quiet humor, of the small but sincere ways she tried to connect with others, even when connection felt strained by insecurity. These are the parts of her story that seldom made it into headlines, for they belong to the realm of real life rather than spectacle. And yet they reveal more about the woman she was than any newspaper photograph ever could. Even in death, Brenda's legacy remained entangled in misinterpretation. Some saw her as a warning against the dangers of becoming too famous too young. Others viewed her story through the lens of class critique, emphasizing the emptiness of wealthy society. And some, with gentler hearts, saw her simply as a young woman trapped in a world too demanding for her fragile spirit. But for all these interpretations, one question lingers beneath them. How should we remember someone whose life was shaped so profoundly by forces beyond her control? Should we remember the debutante or the woman who lived behind her reflection? The symbol or the soul? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps her legacy is both the image and the woman, both the myth and the reality, both the radiance and the shadow. For even as her story warns of the dangers of societal expectation, it also whispers of a longing universal to all human hearts, the longing to be seen, to be understood, to be held gently by those we trust. And in that whisper, her story transcends time, becoming something more than a cautionary tale. It becomes a mirror held up to the world that made her, reflecting the delicate frailty of those who stand too long beneath an unrelenting light. As we linger in this space, imagining her story drifting through time like a pale ribbon caught in a soft breeze, we prepare to step into the final chamber of her journey, one where memory gives way to contemplation, where the ancient storyteller's voice slows, softens, and gathers Brenda's life into a closing reflection that honors both her sorrow and her fleeting, fragile grace. The pale ribbon of her memory drifts in the soft air for a moment longer, suspended between light and shadow as though reluctant to settle. And from this delicate suspension, we enter the final chamber of Brenda's story. It is a chamber not of chronology, nor of spectacle, but of quiet reflection, an ancient contemplative space where the storyteller places a gentle hand upon the past and asks not what happened, but what it meant. Here, the echoes of her life gather not as sharp notes, but as softened tones, blending into one long, melancholic breath that carries the weight of everything she tried to be, everything she lost, and everything she unknowingly left behind. In this final telling, we step away from the noise of the world that once clamored for her image. We step into a place where the chandeliers have long been dimmed, where the marble floors no longer shine with the traces of careful footsteps, where the applause that once shook the air has dissolved into a distant hum no louder than the beat of a quiet heart. And in this softened world, we find not the debutante America obsessed over, nor the fragile icon whose decline fascinated the curious, but simply Brenda, a woman shaped by tenderness she seldom received, by expectations she never chose, by a longing so deep it lived in the very rhythm of her breath. It is in this place that her story must be gathered gently, for there is no need for grandeur now, no need to preserve the illusions that once imprisoned her. Instead, we look upon her life with the kind of compassion that arrives only in hindsight, when the sharp lines of judgment have softened, and all that remains is the question every life eventually asks: was she ever truly seen? We cannot answer with certainty, for history is a mosaic built from fragments, and Brenda's fragments were scattered by hands that seldom paused to understand them. But we can listen to the faint murmurs left behind, the fragile traces of humanity woven through her journey, and we can recognize that she was more than the role she played, more than the beauty she embodied, more than the sorrow that shadowed her final years. If we lean close, we can almost sense the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat in the spaces between the known and the forgotten, a rhythm steady yet soft, shaped by yearning, hope, and an enduring desire for gentleness. We can imagine her as a child moving through the large, echoing rooms of her fractured home, seeking warmth in places where warmth had grown thin. We can imagine her as a young woman stepping into the public eye, not with confidence, but with trembling grace, carrying the weight of expectations she did not yet know how to name. We can imagine her later, sitting alone at a small table as the world moved on without her, holding a cup of tea between her frail hands and staring out a window at the slow procession of seasons she no longer felt part of. These images, though imagined, come closer to truth than any headline ever did, for they honor the quiet places of her story, the places where she lived not as an icon, but as a human being. And what of the sorrow that followed her? What of the loneliness that gathered like mist around the edges of her days? These, too, must be held gently, for they were not failings but companions. Unwanted, yes, but woven from the threads of a life shaped by forces far greater than her own will. Her eating disorder, born from a desperate attempt to control something, anything in a life dictated by others, was not vanity but pain folded inward. Her depression, unspoken in an era that hid such struggles behind closed doors, was the unhealed echo of a childhood devoid of stable affection. Her fear of fading beauty was not superficiality, but the fear of losing the only language of value she had ever been taught. These truths, painful but human, reveal not weakness but a vulnerability so profound it became almost sacred in its tenderness. And so we come to the question that drifts like a soft breeze through the closing pages of her story. What remains? What lingers after the lights dim, after the applause ends, after the world forgets? For Brenda, what remains is not the glamour of her debut, nor the tragedy of her decline, but the subtle imprint of a life that reflected, in so many ways, the fragile dance between identity and expectation. She is remembered, though imperfectly, not because she lived a flawless life, but because her life illuminated the delicate balance that so many must navigate, the balance between who we are and who the world insists we must be. In her story, we glimpse the early shape of a culture that would later consume countless others, a culture that adores the surface and neglects the soul. Yet we also glimpse the enduring humanity that persists beneath such pressures, the longing to be loved, the desire to be understood, the quiet resilience that allows a heart to continue beating even when the world has turned away. These elements of her life form a legacy far more profound than the one etched into society columns of the past. They invite us to consider the cost of beauty when it becomes a burden, the pain of admiration when it masks isolation, the sorrow of becoming a symbol before one becomes a self. And in this final reflection, one might imagine Brenda standing in a dim hall, not as the girl descending the staircase, but as the woman she became afterward, pausing in a soft circle of lamplight. Her features are older now, etched with the tenderness of everything she endured. She wears no gown, no jewels, no carefully arranged expression. She is simply herself, quiet, contemplative, touched by both shadow and light. The air around her hums faintly, as though carrying the distant echo of music long silenced. She looks ahead, not with fear, but with a kind of soft acceptance, as though she knows her story will now drift into the world on its own, shaped not by her, but by those who choose to remember. In this image, we find a fitting farewell, not a dramatic ending, but a quiet one, shaped by the gentle truth that even the most scrutinized lives contain secret chambers no spotlight can reach. And as the last thread of her tale unwinds into the stillness, we sense that perhaps the most compassionate way to remember her is not as an icon, nor as a tragedy, but as a young woman who carried her heart tenderly through a world that seldom offered tenderness in return. With this, we close the story, letting its final notes drift into the soft dark like a candle flame, surrendering to night, leaving behind a gentle warmth in the memory of all who listen.